since it's the pivotal term for section H and indeed for all of chapter 4. And so this week I'm gonna quickly recap what we did in the previous weeks and move on to the core of the thing, which is where we come to what is sophrosune and what is its opposite that we have to be on guard against in order to have sophrosune. And to what extent do we have sophrosune? And this is for the Greeks, this is the whole question of who is an Aristos and who is not. It has to do with this key term. And the question of who's an Aristos and who's not, it all centers around this problem of what does it take for Homo sapiens to be a viable species? This is what the Greeks are worried about. After reviewing their own history, they have some pessimism, but they have a plan. they think they can deal with and overcome at least let's say treat or ameliorate the worst problems of the human condition. Um, so we want to make sure we understand what this condition is described as.
Right.
So for those joining us who haven't been here before, welcome. This is the Kenneth Smith Philosophy Seminar Series. And this particular series is on his book, Millennia and Microcosm, to be coming out forthcoming. The chapters of the book were published as separate articles in a column called End Times in the years 1998 through 2000, 2001, that time frame. And David has scanned them and collected them for us online. I put the link up there to chapter 4, Ancient Civilizations, which has been our focus for most of these 106 sessions. And we're down to, it's divided into 8 lettered sections. Each section tries to point out some critical aspect of the ancient worldview that's very alien to the modern worldview. Very, very different. And if we put all those things together, we can sort of approximate, in a rough way, how the ancients saw the world, how they valued things, how they made their decisions, what they were trying to accomplish with their civilizations. And that helps us to understand modernity. Instead of modernity just being the good epoch and all the other epochs are the bad epochs that were primitive and don't know what they're doing. Kenneth is trying to move us in the direction of understanding that each epoch has its own worldview. Each worldview has strengths, but also weaknesses. Our worldview also has weaknesses. It has blind spots. There's things moderns have a very hard time understanding that people in other epochs might have had an easy time understanding. We're not just better than everybody else, contrary to our dogma. So the study of the ancient worldview in chapter 4, and then in the chapters that follow, when we finish chapter 4, we'll move on to the medieval worldview. That's going to help us triangulate back on the modern worldview and say, not who do we claim to be in our political speeches and our sermons and our self-congratulatory rhetoric, but who are we really, and what are our strengths and weaknesses, and what can we learn from other epochs. So we're looking at section H, sophism and corruption. This is talking about the fall from sort of what we might say the pinnacle of classical Greek civilization. And how did it happen and why did it happen? I put the first paragraph of that there in the chat for those who are catching up. There's obviously a lot of loaded terminology. We spent a long time going through this over the previous sessions, but feel free to ask questions if you get lost here. And what we're really trying to focus on for the last 3 sessions and probably for the next 1 or 2 is this core term sophrosune. And sophrosune is the aristocratic virtue that the other castes in the Greek world were believed to lack. And it was believed that people without sophrosune, when they're given power, it corrupts them, and they then in turn corrupt society by wielding that power badly. And whether they're right or wrong, it's important to understand what their argument was. What's the core of this thing? So we're looking at sophrosune, and we're doing that by augmenting Kenneth's book with this book by F.M. Cornford from the early 20th century called Thucydides Myth Historicus. So we're using Thucydides' account, classical Athenian. This is classical Athenian text. Thucydides' account of the history of the Peloponnesian War, and how did he try to explain why it happened. For those who know the history, in brief, the perception was that Athens had a golden age of kind of wise governance that was the envy of the rest of Greece. But by the time we get into the Peloponnesian War, we see Athens behaving very foolishly, very aggressively, picking fights, overextending itself. And indeed, the Peloponnesian War ends with Athens in defeat and Sparta victorious, which nobody foresaw at the outset of the war. Even the Spartans went into it thinking, well, we're probably going to lose, but we're Spartans, so we don't care. We have to fight this fight. Um, but the Athenians blew it. And so Thucydides is trying to explain what could have happened to Athens to make them fall from the previous heights of wise governance into this disaster. And as Cornford argues, Thucydides is using the psychological framework of ancient Greek tragedy, especially as expressed by Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, looking at how did they think human character worked? How did they think human decision making and personality worked? How did they think people lost their way and came to make foolish decisions? And so we've been supplying, for the last couple of weeks, we've been supplying some terms. I'm going to chuck them into the chat in a second before I call on Phil. Supplying some key terms that the Greeks used to try to understand the nature of human character, the nature of tragedy, and the nature of the human species. And we are partway through that list. So I'm just going to grab them and paste them in there. I'm not going to talk about them yet because I want to call on Phil in a second. But let me first throw in the terms we've discussed so far. And they are these. So real quickly, daimon, nosos, charis, and theos, and methixis are the first 5 terms that describe the relationship between human beings and the enthusiasms that possess us. Either all the time because of the nature of our character, or from time to time when they intrude upon our lives. And if they intrude, it's because we are not on guard against them, because we are vulnerable to them, blind to them. If we're on guard, then to some extent we can resist them. And then it also here talks about this pair of terms, gnome and tuke, as being the critical factors that determine the outcome of human actions. And so Thucydides uses these terms of gnome and tuke to describe, in the course of the Peloponnesian War, some things happen because of agency, humans' efforts, the things that they plan and try to do, but some things happen by fortune, by contingency, regardless of what people's plans were, and that there's a complex dialectic between gnome and tuke that's at work in deciding the outcome of the war. Then there is this pair of terms, dysdaimon and eudaimon, that have to do with, are you born with an unlucky character, a poor character that leaves you vulnerable to possession by these enthusiasms? Or are you born with a healthy character, a lucky character that helps you to be on guard? And most importantly, helps you to understand the responsibility that you have to cultivate your own character, to make it better than what you were born with, to try to improve your character, to reduce the number of opportunities that these keres, these daimones of Knossos, have to take us over and lead us astray. So we'll come back to all this in a moment, and particularly the next section is specifically about Sophrosune. I have a collection of terms I'm going to bring in that we can look at to see what is the structure of Sophrosune. But first, Phil, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, this gets to the heart of the issue, right? I mean, like, not only did the Greeks in general altogether won a war against the uh, the Persians twice, but they collected taxes from all of the states in order to do so. And at the end, they should have given those taxes away back to the states. In addition, Athens was a powerful navy, and they gained their wealth through exchange in the markets, bringing in all sorts of things, as well as a navy that's very strong to block any invasions. So they built the wall from Athens to Piraeus to protect Piraeus. So all of that was, in some sense, a transformation from one of, I guess, human virtues to an interest in the market structure, coinage, if you want to say it that way. So wealth, that sounds a lot like modern existence. Now I'll ask a side question. It's a personal question. Since I'm Chinese, I'm obviously a barbarian. So therefore, I could never be an Aristotle, right? So that's just a question that's personal. I don't know how much contact they would have, but I'm even further away than Persia. If I have any influence from the Persians, I've had it. Uh, so that's kind of two questions, observation about what happened actually in Greece, in Athens in particular, and then a question about myself. You can ignore the second question if you want. All
Actually,
right.
I'm really interested in the second question. I have some ideas about that. So let's talk about that briefly. So, and we'll come back to the first question. So, as we've said in the past, but it's maybe new to the people who are just joining us. The Greek structure, the Greek class system is you have to look at it amphibiously through more than one view. On the one hand, it's the class system established by the invading Indo-Europeans when they conquered the indigenous peoples of the Hellenic Peninsula and made them their slaves. They then said, okay, so we, the Greek-speaking people who have invaded, we're the ruling class. And you guys, the non-Greek speaking people that we've taken over and who now we've enslaved, you're the lower class and you have to work for us. And that was the origins of the thing. The class system was originally just, haha, you can't stop us. And they tried to rationalize, but everybody has to find a way to live with themselves. In Five Stages of Greek Religion, Gilbert Murray talks a bit about the ways in which you can trace in the structure of the Greek religion are a number of features that are designed to help the Greeks live with themselves after they slaughtered people and then took everything from them and enslaved them. And in part there was this is partly what led to the Greek anti-fundamentalism, the tendency to say we don't have all the answers when it comes to the divine. When we take over your land, we're not going to suppress your gods. We're going to merge your gods into our pantheon and expand our pantheon to include your gods, because the things you're most likely to fight over are the things that you consider sacred. So if we agree to hold them sacred too, it reduces your reason to fight. So this is interesting. This is a very non-medieval perspective. So they ended up with shared deities, but they still imposed this class hierarchy. And so they had to come up with a justification for the hierarchy itself. And the justification they come up with was this: if you had had the warrior spirit, you would never have let yourself be enslaved. We would rather die than be enslaved. And the fact that you didn't kill yourselves when we beat you proves that you deserve to be slaves, and it proves that we deserve to rule. This is what they told themselves. They said there's a fundamental difference of character. You have a slavish personality, and that's why you're a slave, and we have a free personality, and that's why we're free people. So this is where their class system starts, is with these rationalizations. But as the centuries, indeed over 1,000 years pass, they developed what started out as a rationalization ended up becoming more and more sophisticated, because the rationalization had to be better. New generations of Greeks who weren't involved in the conquest might have felt more ambivalent about it than the ones who first came in and took everything. And on top of that, as more and more people were exposed to the Greeks through their growing trading empire, they had to come up with a schema that could account for all these other people who were neither the conquered nor the conquerors. And so they expanded it and shifted it from, haha, we won, so we're on top. They shifted it to, what are the characteristics that people ought to have in order to be worthy of ruling? And what are the characteristics that if people have them, they're incompetent to rule? And as they developed this more sophisticated kind of what we might call ancient psychology, there began to be problems seeing where their actual physical class system that they had didn't always match up very well with their increasingly, sophisticated way of justifying how government ought to work. And Aristotle in particular deals with this. in his works. It's a little hard for moderns to notice, but his whole description of the classes makes clear that there should be class mobility. In fact, if there isn't class mobility, then the entire modern justification, modern, I mean classical Greek justification for their existing class system falls apart. It has to be the case that if someone is born into the aristoi but has a slavish personality, they should move down to the slave class. And if someone is born in the slave class but they have an eristic ruling personality, then they should be raised to the ruling class. And Aristotle is basically arguing, to the extent to which Greek city-states fail to do this, they fail to live up to their own justification for having a class system in the first place. And so there's a lot of time in the time that we're really looking at, especially the time of Aristotle, there's a great deal of questioning of the usual justification of who's a citizen and who's not a citizen. Um, so when it comes to somebody like yourself, who was raised, your ancestors were from Asia. Let's imagine that, the ancestral Phil spoke Chinese or something. Maybe it was Han Chinese. I don't know. To the Greeks, they had their rationalization, the popular rationalizations that said, well, the people from the north, like those, proto-Vikings and Germanic people, they have a lot of courage, but they're dumb. So that's why they don't get to govern. The people from Asia, by which they mostly meant Persia, but they did have experience across the Silk Road with people further on. They said, now those people are smart, but they're cowards. They're willing to be enslaved, and that's why they shouldn't govern. They said, only we Greeks combine courage and intelligence in a marvelous, beautiful package, and that's why we should be in charge. So this is the rationalization that they were using, even above and beyond the questions of language, barbaroi. Everybody knows the reference to other languages. Even aside from that, this is the rationalization they would have tried to use to keep you out. But had Aristotle and his like prevailed in the argument, if they encountered you and discovered that you were both intelligent and courageous, then that would suggest that the doors had to be opened up to you, to find your way, through whatever process into the ruling class.
Well,
So there's some ambivalence around this question of where you would have fit, is what I'm getting at.
Good explanation. That leads me to ask uh, actually two more. One is that was that the transition from the I know art better, so there's a classical Dorian column and then the Corinthian column and no the
Oh,
the Corinthian and then
Doric, Ionic, Corinthian.
that's right. Uh, that question that second question is like, well, is that why how much of the Greek philosophy still was embedded in America? Because we clearly defeated the Japanese, but with kamikaze, they rather die. At least
Uh-huh.
many of them, they rather die than to be defeated.
Right.
And so, in fact, they have a ritual suicide that they have to commit. So, is that why we were very nice to the Japanese? Because we could have turned them into slaves, but we didn't. So I'm sure there's different reasons, but I'm just asking that as a joke question because the Japanese, in that sense, they were not cowards. Maybe they were
Yes.
not smart, although Yamamoto seemed to be very smart. We should be doing
Pretty
this.
smart.
But yeah,
Pretty smart.
yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
that's all I want to do. So you can go ahead and answer the second question.
Yeah. So, that was a good question. The other one, just about what was happening at the time. Yeah, that's some useful background. For those who don't know the background, the reason the Peloponnesian War happened is that all of the separate Greek polities, each polis, they used to be like the Renaissance Italian city-states. They used to be more or less separate political entities. They had relationships, complicated relationships in a lot of different ways with each other, whether they were trading partners or a stronger one is one city-state the daughter colony of an earlier city-state. So each of the old city-states, when their population got too large, would send out, as an expedition, they'd send out colonies that would go set up a new city state, and they maintained kind of mother-daughter relationships with each other. And there were other reasons that there were connections to through tribes and family and so on. But really they were just a confederation of separate polities until the Persians invaded. When the Persians invaded, they realized that they were going to be defeated if they couldn't band together. So they formed the Delian League. And the Delian League said, since Athens is going to bear the brunt of this, they've got the navy, they were the most populous city state. They have the most free people, and free people are the ones who mostly fight back then, or at least lead the fights. But they needed the support of the other city states to match Persia's wealth. And so they formed Delos was the island. It was a sacred island. The idea was that it would act as a treasury. All this money would come from all the other city states and funnel into Athens, and Athens would use it to fund its army and fund its navy and everything else, and help to coordinate the the resistance against Persia. And they won. It was complete surprise to everybody but the Greeks that tiny, backwards, completely disunited Hellas was able to pull itself together to defeat the mightiest empire on earth at the time, Persia. Hi Joe, good to see you. So all hail the mighty Greeks for being able to pull that off. The problem is that after the war, Athens insisted that they continue to collect the tax revenues from the Delian League, and their argument was, okay, well, maybe their war is over for the moment, but how do you know the Persians won't just come back and do it again? We have to stay strong militarily. The lesson to be learned, argued Athens, is that when we are disunited, then people look at us and think, well, we can conquer them. And we don't want that to happen again. So now we have to be united and strong. So we're going to keep this puffed up navy and this puffed up army and keep collecting the revenues. And the rest of the city states were like, you know what? I don't think you're right. Persia doesn't seem like it wants to come back and get its butt kicked again. And I think that if we just stop paying our taxes and start being independent again, like we're supposed to be, if we're free, then I don't think anything's going to happen. And if we're wrong, okay, so what? Then we all start paying back into the Delian League. But in the meantime, this needs to stop. And Athens was, nuh-uh. I don't think so. we like all this money that we're getting, and we're using it to build beautiful temples and statues and all these other things. And Athens is increasingly the most beautiful polis in Greece, and we don't want to jeopardize that. So this was kind of a core argument. Pericles even says in a great speech in the history of the Peloponnesian War, okay, collecting money to kill people who are trying to kill you, that's a worthy cause. But isn't it just as worthy to collect money not to kill people, to collect money to do beautiful things, to support the arts and literature and all that? I mean, why should we only pay for war? Why shouldn't we also pay for peace? It's a great and famous speech that he gives. Anyway, that argument and various other things led to the division of the Greek world into those who were willing to continue paying the Delian League to Athens, and those who broke away and said this needs to stop, who kind of joined the Spartans, the Peloponnesian League. So what we see at this time is these questions that Thucydides and others are scratching their heads over: is why is this happening? Why is Athens, insisting on dominating the other city states and forcing them to rebel against them? And in the course of rebellion, Athens's behavior is, as Thucydides points out repeatedly, weirdly foolish. There are things that there are decisions that they're making that fly directly in the face of Athens's entire history of how it conducts foreign affairs and wars. And Thucydides feels this needs an explanation. He says, this is the greatest. Thucydides says, I think this is the most important war that's ever happened. Which, by the way, is a bold claim for the Greeks, right? The Greeks think that the Trojan War is the greatest war that ever happened. And Thucydides is basically saying, not by comparison with this. This is a bigger deal. This is a civil war. This isn't we go and conquer some other people over a bedroom farce because somebody ran off with somebody's wife. This is like there are major issues at stake. And more importantly, the people who sailed off to the Trojan War didn't have a previous example of a massive disaster to warn them off from engaging in such behavior in the future. But every Greek since then has been raised on the Iliad and the Odyssey and the rest of the tales of the returns, the the Agamemnon and all of the other tragedies about how completely the heroes of the Bronze Age Greece destroyed Mediterranean civilization. They're like, our entire civilization now is founded on the precept that we are not going to make that specific mistake ever again, ever again. And it's why we all study tragedy, say the Greeks to one another. We study tragedy to find out how could the best and the brightest of us, with all the virtues, wreck everything. What happened? So that we can try to avoid doing that again. So Thucydides says, this is a novel situation in its scale and its significance. These are people who know better, who know not to do this, who are doing it anyway. And we have to explore how that came to pass. So he opts to use, yes, superior ability breeds superior ambition, Space Seed. Great episode. Great episode. Yeah. There's a lot of the heroic ethos in that character of Khan Noonien Singh in Space Seed in Star Trek. So let's take a look. There are a pair of, if we look at the background of these concepts, and for those who weren't here before, I'll give the capsule version of the first five. The rest really follows from them. The Greeks believed in daimones. Daimones. A daimon is a spirit, and not like a Christian spirit or a ghost or a modern conception of a spirit. It is specifically a character. It's a soul. It's a mind, and it has vitality, and as such, a daimon has authority and influence. So an oasis in a desert has a daimon, and it's because you're about to die, and you come over the rise, and you're saved. You're going to live because of this oasis. It has a power over you. It has an authority over you that you have to respect. And the Greeks' entire religion is based on the premise that nature neither loves us nor hates us, but is full of powerful authorities that it's our job to learn how to harmonize with them and get out of their way when they're stomping around. And when we're in trouble, to know how to appeal to them, not in the way one appeals to the Christian God by begging for favors, but rather, to figure out how can I work with the ocean to not have my fleet sunk? How can I work with, Zeus to not trigger, well, we're going to talk about what you trigger if you don't work with Zeus. How do you work with these great powers in order to not get in trouble? It's like living with mastodons and saber-toothed tigers. You got to learn how they behave and how they act as projections of authority from the natural world. So a daimon is that. Nosos is a physical or mental disease. The Greeks believe that all forms of illness fall into the same category of nosos. It is unwellness. And you can be unwell in a variety of different ways, but they all fall under the term nosos. We don't really quite have a term for this in English. We like to divide things up into little mechanical categories, but they saw them as related to each other. And that brings us to their third term, cares, for which the singular is care. And a care is a daimon that brings nosos. And it brings nosos by possessing you, right? The reason that you get tuberculosis is because the care of tuberculosis finds a weakness in your nature, in your character, and exploits it to possess you, and it brings the disease with it. And they believe it's not just diseases like that, but also weakness, old age, death, foolishness, all the ways in which people can go wrong. For each one, there's a care, and each of those is a daimon. Now, daimones don't have to be bad. Cares are the bad ones. There's also good daimones, that like the oasis in the desert. But cares are the problematic ones. And that brings us to the fourth term, entheos. And that is the state of being possessed, where a mortal is possessed by a god or a daimon. So you see repeatedly in the Iliad and occasionally in the Odyssey and other stories where a character was about to do one thing, but then a god or goddess whispers in their ear, gives them advice, and they go, oh, you're right. It would have been really stupid for me to do that. I'm going to change my mind and go do this smart thing instead. It happens to Odysseus a lot, and I think Jason has it too, where it might be Hera talking to them, it might be Athena talking to them, or what have you. So they believe, for example, the Pythia at the oracle at Delphi is possessed by the god. right, by the divine. And that's why she can utter truths that a mortal couldn't say, wouldn't know, right? And the Greeks totally believe this is happening. The same is true if you fall head over heels in love. The Greeks believe that, Aphrodite or Eros or somebody has got to you and you're possessed by that spirit of attraction or lust or whatever it might be in that particular case. Well, they believe that this is the exact mechanism by which cares get into you and bring nosos. That's how you get ill, is because your nature had a vulnerability that was exploited by a malicious daimon, and now you're sick. And that state of illness, or in the case of good possession by good daimones or deities, that state of inspiration, shall we say, they called entheos. It means the god is within you, entheos. And as I confirmed this week, the word entheos is directly related to the word enthusiasm. People have noticed me saying in previous weeks that Homo sapiens are one of our stupid pet tricks that allows us to thrive is that we're a creature of enthusiasms. We can become enthusiastic about all kinds of different things. Different people could be. You can get people to be excited about things that a cheetah would never be excited about, or a robin, or a tree. They just like they those are things they would just ignore. But they would get excited about the things that are good for them. The cheetah gets excited about chasing the gazelle. But Homo sapiens can get excited about anything. I can get excited about old Star Trek reruns. Thanks to Steven, I'm possessed. I'm gonna have to go watch Space Seed again. I want to see Ricardo Montalban, portraying that ambition, that superior ambition. So we can be. That's in Theos. I've been filled with the enthusiasm, and to the Greeks that literally meant possession, not by a Christian demon, but by a soul, by a spirit that has a nature of its own. And then the final term, methexis, is core to the structure of tragedy. And possession, it's hard for us to hear that term without imagining the medieval connotation, which is I was walking down the road minding my own business when a demon possessed me. Oh, God save me from this demon. It wasn't my fault. I didn't do anything wrong. This just happened to me. There's an implication of sinners in the hands of an angry God, absolutely helpless and passive. We hope that somebody will intervene to save us. That's kind of core to the modern inherited version of the medieval concept of demonic possession. None of that's what the Greeks mean. They mean daimonic or theic, deific possession. And that's where you have to have an inner nature or character that has the right vulnerabilities to make you open to that. And your participation in that possession as an active participant who allowed this to take place and who is making choices, who's being as willful as they can without knowing that their will has been swayed by this possession. This is called methexis. It's the mortal's responsibility and participation in the relationship. Everything that follows builds off these 5 terms, including the stuff that I mentioned before, the things that are in the chat. I'm going to call on Phil again, and then we'll start introducing the rest of the terms. Come off mute, Phil. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, as you were explaining that, there seems to be quite a relationship between paganism, which the Greeks still were, and 19th century pantheism in a way. But I guess it's shifted a little bit more in the 19th century to relationship of spirit, although the Greeks certainly had that as well. So that relationship is, how should I say, more marginalized, but it's clearly there. So how much did the 19th century romantics realize how Greek oriented they were in that relationship, although it's no longer pagan, but is pantheistic, which is still bound to nature in some way in relationships with spirit. So could you say, since you love 19th century music, I know that, that then maybe you could say something more about that relationship because it seemed like a very important intervention in this mechanistic relationship that modernity has in relationship to development of civilization. This seemed like a a sort of, how should I say it, a counterforce to a certain degree. Could you say something about that?
Yes. So, a critical part of this is understanding that although we consider people of European descent generally consider themselves the inheritors of the Greco-Roman tradition, as well as what they call the Judeo-Christian tradition. Um, the Greeks and Romans wouldn't agree. They would say maybe we're closer to the Romans, but not as close as we think. We're actually the heirs to the medieval tradition. And there is an enormous amount of medievality in moderns that they're not willing to acknowledge. We sort of imagine that through the Renaissance we were able to leap back over the Dark Ages and directly interrogate and relate to the ancients. But the ancients had a worldview that was alien to the medieval and alien to ours. And so what we do is we read these texts and we project into them our modern worldview, and we read them as saying something very different from what they were saying. Frequently, we read what they're saying as the exact opposite of what they're saying, because the medieval worldview started with a revolution that overthrew and inverted the value system of the ancient worldview. Just like the modern worldview did it again to the medievals in a new way by creating a world with no values and no virtues, and nothing matters except quantity, how many votes, how much money, how many laws, and so forth. So our interpretation of spirits and ghosts is a sort of a modernist twist on the medieval concept of a spirit or a ghost. But it's not at all the ancient concept. Like, the ancients didn't have originally rewards or punishments after death. And that comes out of the mostly it comes out of the Christian tradition. There were sects in the ancient world that believed that, but the dominant belief was that when you die, you're dead. And here I think one of the critical ways to say it is the medievals believe the soul is the real part of you and the body is just a spacesuit that you're walking around. And when you die, the important thing is, where does your soul go? Do you get punished for all eternity, or do you get rewarded for all eternity? It's one or the other. And because it's eternal, all the stakes are on where does your soul go. It's the most important question. It's why Torquemada could justify torturing people in the name of love. He's like, I'm trying to save your soul. If I don't save your soul, it will be an infinite crime, right? That is perpetrated against you. You're going to be tortured for eternity. So if I torture you for a few hours or weeks, but I get you to convert, then your soul is saved and you'll be rewarded for eternity. So really, it doesn't matter what I do to your body. Once you start factoring, it's like when you do math. You divide by zero, or you subtract infinity. You start messing with zero and infinity, and all the math goes haywire. So that's how moderns interpret ghosts. That's the important part of you. That's the mind of you, right? It's the life force of you. But that's not how the ancients saw things. The ancients saw things as your body is who you are. When you die, your body begins to decay because it lost its spirit. Your spirit is what was holding you together, your psyche, your breath. And when your breath leaves your body, then your body ceases to hold together and begins to fall apart again. That's not an empty shell falling apart. That's you. This is the opposite of the medieval concept of a ghost or a soul. You're falling apart. Where your soul goes almost doesn't matter, because that's not you. Interestingly, the Navajo have the same idea. They believe that when you die, you exhale your soul and it goes back and merges with the atmosphere. And what's left behind, you don't have a life after death. The traditional Navajo belief is you focus on people while they're alive. When they die, you do what you're supposed to do in the ritual, and then you try not to think about them or talk about them ever again, because they aren't anywhere, right? They're decomposing under some rocks somewhere, right? They're not, all the good things are gone. So the Greeks believe that Hades is not a place of punishment. Everybody who translates Hades as hell has completely missed the boat. And it's the same if they translate, Hades as heaven, or the Elysian fields as heaven. They didn't have a heaven and a hell. As is made clear in the Odyssey and in other places, the shades of people in Hades are empty twittering things. They have no life. They have no vitality. Odysseus has to feed them his own blood. Or I can't remember whose blood he feeds them, whether it's an animal or his. But he has to feed them blood to put some physical corporeality back into them, even in order to have a conversation with them, to give them a little bit of the reality and life of the body, so that the mind has some kind of purchase to be able to think clearly. Again, the opposite of the medieval worldview. So all of these Victorian seances and trances, and they're bringing spirits hither and thither. None of that would be recognized by the ancients as coherent. It wouldn't make sense to them. They're like, what are you going to say to that thing? It doesn't have a body. It doesn't have blood. It's just a twittering empty thing. It's a breath of air, is what it is. It's a breath of air that happens to carry with it a character and a mind, but that can't function because it doesn't have a body. It's not that, it's not you anymore after you're dead. So it's a really interesting inversion. It's hard for us to fully grok. So in this and countless other ways, we aren't really the heirs of Greco-Roman tradition. We're sort of we're the cuckoos who move into the nest and kick out the other baby birds. And we say, lo, I am a robin. Behold, I was raised by robin parents. I'm totally a robin. But there's nothing about us that's a robin other than the fact that we took their nest and are using their resources. Maybe we learned to imitate their calls, but we're totally a different thing from the Greeks and Romans, as we'll see when we get into this question of Sophrosyne. It's a great question, Phil. Thanks for bringing it up. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm a bit wondering about the idea that the pagans had a very dim view of the afterlife. Is an impression you get in some of the stories. I think is it one of the stories, Odysseus is shown the realm of the dead by that witch or something like that, and it's the heroes are saying, no, you don't want to go to the world of the dead. It's pretty grim place. But I'm not sure this is really the universal. You look in some of these cultures, now you take like the Vikings, you've got a culture there which is very similar to the Greeks. It's a funny thing, you can go from Scandinavia, you can go to Finland, so you've got racial type or whatever is very similar, but culturally, they're complete odds. The Scandinavians were inheritors of something which would, similar to the Greeks and the Romans, the tradition of the warrior chieftain surrounded by his poets saying how wonderful he is and stuff like that. But the Vikings, I was looking up, they had it seems quite a number of these realms of the dead. You see something similar to the Greeks, but they seem to have a number of realms. And as with the Greeks, the heroes went to the brightest realm. Now, that just leaves me the impression, and I could be wrong, that the pagan culture, which our dear Master Nietzsche, thought of as the grander prospect, that was teaching its people that to get to the highest heaven, you must excel in your earthly life. You must be a great hero. If you're just going to shirk at home and be a coward, you're not going to work out really greatly in the afterlife. Whereas the Christians come along and said, well, it's sort of okay to be a coward as long as you're humble and bow and scrape before the great, and don't exceed too much. Don't become too much of an egotist. Don't become too self-aggrandizing. So between the Christians and the pagans, we seem to have very divergent views on behaviour. The pagans demanding, no, don't sit at home. Go out and achieve greatness. Whereas the Christians are seen to be saying, well, don't go out on a limb with greatness too much. That's just an impression I've got. So I was wondering what your thoughts on that were. So
That's a great question, Stephen. Thank you. Yeah, so What's interesting about these pagan religions is that they're in processes of change at the moment that they're being documented, whether it's the Greek or the Norse. Finnish is a little different because they're come from Finno-Ugric stock, so they're related more to the Huns and some of the Siberian cultures. But certainly, the Greeks and the Norse share the Indo-European roots. So they've got some of the same stuff that we're going to find, in the Vedas in India, and we're going to see some of the same stuff in Zoroastrianism in Iran. There's an otherworldly element, but how it's expressed varies, and even among the Norse, it varied over time. So we don't know for sure what the Norse religion looked like before it encountered Christianity and people began to write it down. But we know that at the time people are writing it down, we already see the fingerprints of a massive shift happening. The older gods, the Vanir, like Frey and Freya, Lord and Lady are what they meant. They're very different deities than the Azir, like Odin and Thor and Tyr. And there's some question about, was the Azir religion a cult within the Norse that used to be on the side, but under contact with Christianity rose to dominance and nearly eclipsed the old Vanir religion that was there? We're not sure. We know that Valhalla, Odin's, great hall where the warriors gather in preparation for Ragnarok, was not the first hall. We know Freya already had a hall. I can't remember the name of it right now. I usually could give you the name off the top of my head. And, Valkyries originally worked for her. And then once the Azir religion rose up, the Valkyries were split into two groups, the ones that collected for Freya and the ones that collected for Odin. And different people went to different places. We can also see there's an interesting fatalism in the Azir religion, in which the reason to go to Valhalla isn't to be rewarded for all eternity. They sort of set themselves up in opposition to the Christian vision of heaven. And they said the reason to go to Valhalla is to increase the strength of the gods so that when the world ends, with the final battle against all the terrible things that are coming, you can lend your strength to ensure that the right side wins. In other words, the sort of life of war that they envisioned here on Earth, they replicated in their afterlife, and said only the worthy will be allowed to suffer and strive to try to fight in the final battle, and the unworthy, just be thrown to Hela to be consumed or treated like crap, because that's what you are if you're not willing to fight. So it's a really interesting kind of, it's got a different motivation than the Christian, I need to terrify you with hell, to try to motivate you to want to go into heaven. They're almost there's parallels that can be drawn, but when we look closely, we realize they're almost incompatible with each other. But you could see how an Azir cult might rise to prominence if a Vanir religion were to encounter Christianity and be struggling to figure out, well, how do I reconcile their alien beliefs with our alien beliefs?
Well, the usual outlook is Vanir were the original inhabitants of Scandinavia, and the Aesir were invaders.
Yes.
And well, I think Snorri was claiming that the Aesir passed through Russia, which is interesting in the middle of in the depths of the medieval epoch.
Yeah.
This guy's saying, well, our culture originated in Asia, which of course became the thing scientifically about 5 centuries later. And it's sort of more very widely accepted now.
Yeah.
Which is quite a tradition, because Snorri's talking about an event which must have already been 2,500 years old.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
But so who were the Vanir? Were they another group of Indo-Europeans, or were they completely native to Scandinavia? Well, for example, the god Frey, the counterpart seems to have been the god Ingve, which was the one that was worshipped in
the
Germany
Anglo-Saxons.
outside
Yeah, that's right.
Scandinavia, but somehow the god Frey became prominent. Now, another thing, of course, the Aesir showed a different sort of behavior. For one of the things, they aggravated the Vanir because the Aesir liked slaves and liked
Yes.
collecting slaves and demanded a tribute in slaves. So the Aesir had a much stronger commercial element. They might have had trade routes
Yeah.
that was reaching down to the Mediterranean. That was in the legend as well. It suggests that they had trade routes going to Troy.
Yes.
They were into
Yes.
money.
Yes.
They brought the advance of money
Yes.
to a more primitive world.
Yeah, it's very interesting stuff. It's very interesting stuff. I love comparing these things. But if you look at the archaeological evidence, it sort of bears out what you're saying, Snorri said, because the timing of the Indo-European invasions of Europe is shockingly late. We imagine that white people have been there forever, but we know now that 8,000 BCE, at least in Western Europe, the dominant type was dark-skinned and blue-eyed, which is a combo we don't normally see. And that, Indo-Europeans didn't reach Britain until 3,000 to 2,500 BCE. And it's a similar time frame for when they cross over into Norway. We know there were people already there. There were earlier generations of people there before the Indo-Europeans got there. So, what you're describing, it parallels the stories that the Greeks tell about their own invasion of the Greek peninsula, which is that there were already these people living there in the Greek peninsula, and they were speaking non-Greek and, as far as we can tell, non-Indo-European languages. And then they're the people who, the invading Indo-Europeans set up a class system on top of and introduced money and all the same things you're talking
I
about happening up
might
in there.
differ there. And I've been looking at this for a long time, but
Yeah.
The original inhabitants of Europe were more hunter-gatherers.
Yeah, especially in the north and
And
west.
well, they might have had a darker skin originally, but over time they became very pale.
Yes.
And then people came from the Middle East, people who are essentially Middle Eastern, and they became a large contributor to the population of Europe.
They brought Neolithic
But they brought
technology.
agriculture.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, this is one of the huge mistakes that was made with some scholars, even as little as 50 years ago, as they thought these people who brought agriculture were Indo-Europeans, but
No.
they weren't.
No. And that's about
And
6,000, 5,000 BCE. They move along the Mediterranean and then move north.
you've got to watch out with the Indo-Europeans because their Y haplotype
Right.
is related to the Turks.
Yeah.
And
We could
actually,
spend all day talking about this. I
the
love this stuff.
American Indians. So it's as though they went towards Europe and they took on European auto
But I but I
DNA
but I
through,
got to
I don't
stick a
know,
pin in
stealing
this.
women or something like that.
I got to stick a pin in it, Stephen, because I could talk about this all day. I love this area of study, but this
Okay.
won't get us any closer to this chapter. It's to anybody interested, Google the Indo-European invasions, the spread of the Indo-European language, look at the time frames, look at the spread of Neolithic culture, like Stephen said, into Europe, look at the time frame, and then look at Western hunter-gatherers, Eastern hunter-gatherers, and so on, and you'll see the earlier group that populated Europe prior to either of those groups coming in. We're making strides every year now in archaeology in this area. It's part of why Stephen and I are so interested in this. It's every single year there's some major breakthroughs in the timing and understanding of when these things happen. So when Stephen makes a comparison between Norse culture and Greek culture, that's entirely worthy because we know Indo-Europeans moved into Norway and also down into the Hellenic Peninsula. Not exactly the same time frame, but it's part of the same general move west out of the Caucasus Mountains. So I'm gonna call on Phil in a second, but I think first I'm gonna drop our first terms here. It looks like I haven't done it yet, so let me do it now. This group of terms is one of the terms I want to deal with today. And this is around this question that we've been talking about. We said the Greeks believe that one of the critical things about Homo sapiens is that we are the only animal that doesn't understand what's good for us. Every other animal knows instinctively what's good for us, and it's fascinated by the things that are good for it. Each animal has its arete, its distinctive excellence that allows it to live the healthy life that nature has evolved for it. And the arete, of a salmon is very different from the arete of a Canada goose, which is very different from the arete of a gazelle, and so on. But each of them, has been fitted with this suite of instincts that makes them notice and take an interest in and pursue those parts of the world around them that not coincidentally are the things they should be paying attention to in order to maximize the health and vitality of the individual and the species. This is the Greeks call this their arete. The cheetahs need to chase what it's fascinated by. The salmons need to go downstream after it hatches and spend years out in the exciting ocean. But after a certain amount of time, it needs to go home. It needs to go home and breed and die. And it isn't going to get distracted by becoming a collector of Warner Brothers cartoons. It's not going to get distracted by saying, I should just stay here in the ocean and make a giant pyramid. It's not, these kinds of things that happen to Homo sapiens can't happen to these species, not because they're inferior to us, but because they're different from us. And the nature of the difference, the Greeks believed, was that in some ways they're superior to us because they have an internal compass, if you will, given to them by their instincts that allows them to know which direction healthy is. What should I be doing right now? Is not a question that they magically, utopianly always answer correctly, but they often have a sense of where they should be going and what they should be focusing on. And after, cats, all the cat family, after they hunt down and kill something, and they got to get all bloody and gory from eating because they're predators, they have an instinct to rest. And during that rest, they have an instinct to clean themselves from nose to tail tip. Just absolutely from top to bottom. And if you've ever spent time with cats, especially if you've got multiple ones, they get into these grooming frenzies where they're just like, I have to get absolutely clean. Absolutely clean. They don't live like pigs. They don't live like people. They're cleaner in general than either of those types of animals. Because if they don't get the blood off of them, they're going to smell like blood and they'll never catch another animal again because everybody will smell them coming because they reek like a charnel house, right? There's a reason why they need to clean themselves after they eat. And their attachment and commitment to that healthy way of life is stronger than any attachment that we have to anything healthy. Even our appetites for food, basic things like food and water, we easily lose track of those things. If we're having a good time, we forget to eat. Plenty of people forget to take a bath. I mean, we can easily forget the most important things for our health and vitality. But you can't get a cat to forget to clean itself after it hunts. It has an ethos, a character, an inner nature. Its soul, the part of it that animates it, that makes it a moving, intelligent, feeling being, it's not random and open and free. It's not protean. It can't become anything. It has a very distinctive, specific character that is the right character for that species, more or less. There's variation. Anyone who's owned multiple cats, they're all individuals, but there's a cattishness that's in common in all of them, and that's the ethos of a cat. And that ethos brings a lot of instincts that make them interested in the sorts of things that help them to develop their aretes. Why does the kitten want to play and jump and leap and stalk? Because it has to learn how to develop that arete to become the greatest stalking and pouncing hunter. If it doesn't play, it will never get good at those things. It has to develop its muscles and its ligaments and its tendons and its bones. It has to develop its understanding of timing and stealth. When am I hidden? When do I only think I'm hidden, but my tail's hanging out so everybody knows I'm there? All these things they have to learn, but they need to learn them. They want to learn them. Their ethos drives them to engage in the behavior that maximizes the specific suite of arites that make that species good at what it does. And it's the same for every animal species. And the Greeks knew that. Aristotle writes about this. And modern attempts to translate these terms like ethos and arete they might as well be gibberish. They're completely wrong. We like translate arete as virtue. Virtue is as vague and arm wavy and non-specific as you can get and still have any relationship at all to what Aristotle's getting at, which is this species knows how to survive because it wants to do the things that are good for it as a species. And it wants to do the things that will help it get better than it is right now. Each individual member of the species wants those things. Its desires are not a curse. Its desires are a blessing because they lead it in the direction of health. The next term, actually, I'm not going to do the next term. I'm going to call on Phil, and then we'll come back to the next term. So, Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question about Egyptian mythology, but because you mentioned this is so striking that I thought I would say something about it. So, if animals have instinct, they are sort of in a channel. In other words, they have to do what they're going to do. It seems like human beings have, whether it's through evolution or whether, through God in the Garden of Eden or whatever, has possessed this thing, in the Garden of Eden. I used to think that human beings ate from the apple of knowledge, of the fruit of knowledge, okay? And it gave them some kind of understanding of the world, and maybe even wisdom. Now I understand better that by giving this.
I think your audio dropped out.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Are you hearing me now? No, you're not hearing me?
Yeah. I didn't hear anything strange.
Okay.
Yeah.
Must have been my end. Keep going.
Okay. So now I think it seems like what we traded is a kind of emptiness of how to trade in this sort of restricted structure to something of potentiality to actuality. And in between that is what you call virtuality. So we traded, in a sense, this more constricted channel into our behavior, and to say, now you're liberated, you have all sorts of potentials ahead of you. But those potentials is nothing until you actualize it, right? And you actualize it, and to actualize it, you have to think and invent something that is kind of virtue. I mean, it's on the way of becoming an actuality from the potential, but it could also fall short or also fall wrong. So you live with this sort of burden of, let's say, how do we open up these possibilities rather than close it down? And in some way, that really is kind of the human experience in different forms. And so that means we are, I wouldn't say necessarily in the red zone, but let's put it this way. Instead of a green light, like whether it's a cheetah or turtle or whatever, it's green light, but it's all a one-lane road. That's it. For us, there's a yellow light. The yellow light could lead to a red light or a green light. So we have to make choices all the time. So that's an interesting possibility, is whether we want to have this sort of diversity, I suppose you could say freedom of choice, and make the right choice or make the wrong choice. But we don't know right at the moment because it's a damn yellow light. You know? It's like, so we have to, uh, I don't know, I guess have some way of either computating that or intuit that, or, or just let's just take a chance and we'll backtrack later if we need to. I don't know how that goes. I mean, it certainly brings to mind, you know, of the atomic bomb. You know, let's test this. We want to know whether it works. And what his name now? The movie just came out, but the guy who was the head
Oppenheimer.
yeah, Oppenheimer. That's right. He was warned by both the people who in the lab as well as Enrico Fermi that there is a chance this yellow light that's blinking now could be a red light because there's a chance it could cause a chain reaction in the atmosphere. We all die. And the lab says, you know, we computed this, we did the best we can. It's a very small chance. So, well, couldn't you get it down to zero? No, we can't. And so I remember when they exploded a bomb, afterwards, there was a there was a funny feeling. There was a funny feeling because everybody cheered. And when I saw the movie, I was thinking, how many of them were cheering because success, green light? How many people cheer because, oh, we're so lucky it's not a red light? You know what I mean? Like,
It didn't blow up the world. Yay!
that's right. I mean, like, I would have been cheering the other way, you know, even though I might have pushed it. It's like I would have been cheering that way rather than green light, great success, whatever. And then only Oppenheimer later realized, no, it actually was a red light. We didn't realize it, you know. So there you are. I think most of the people probably cheered because it was the green light, you
Yeah,
know. That
yeah.
potentiality became an actuality, but later on it could destroy the world. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Phil. It's a great example. I mean, I can be 100% sure that there's not a member of any species other than Homo sapiens on this planet that would ever think of making a nuclear bomb. They just, our explanation is it's because we're smarter than they are. But that's not it at all. I mean, they're very smart at the things that they do. In fact, at the things they do, they're often much, much smarter than we are. We're often trying to approximate their art because we don't have their artes. To have an arete for a species means, to the extent possible, you need to be the best at that. You have to be the one that can survive because you're so good at that thing by comparison with anybody else. And the more you get into comparative biology, the more you learn the incredible gifts that different animal species have. And that's just animal species. Let's talk about fungi, which are just little factories that can manufacture almost anything. It's amazing the substances that fungi can create. Simple little, seemingly simple little organisms. So there is a lot going on. We have the ability to do things nobody's ever done before, but we got that in a very dangerous, difficult way. So, before I go on, I see Sharon's got her hand up, and I'd love to hear from Sharon. So come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I'm confused. So, okay. So the question I'm asking is your definition of phronesis here, which I thought was the development of practical wisdom over a period of time. And I think we talked about this earlier. But so this definition seems different to me. Is there a link between the two?
There is, and I'm going to come to it today.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. We're working our way up to that. So yeah, we'll talk about that. If you read traditional modern definitions of phronesis, they call it practical intelligence. We can tell it must be important because Aristotle and the others won't shut up about it. They clearly think it's important, but we don't know what it is. So we think, well, what do we think is the most important thing? Well, we, as moderns, we think being smart's the most important thing. So it must be some kind of intelligence. And of course, the kind of intelligence, the only kind of intelligence that we respect is practical intelligence, know-how and getting things done. So we say, if this is the best of all possible forms of intelligence, it must be practical intelligence because that's the only thing we're capable of valuing. That's not what the Greeks meant at all. That's just us projecting our value system on top of it.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it's a
Thank
great
you.
question. And we're gonna come to it in a sec. And understanding phronesis and sophron sets us up to understanding sophrosune, which is related to both of these terms. So
Okay.
there's a little sequence we're doing here. Great question, Sharon. So we've got ethos, that's your character, your nature. And by the way, the one that's not on the list, but taken for granted, but let me just say it briefly. Psyche, I mentioned it before, soul, what we translate as soul. Psyche doesn't mean anything like a Christian soul at all. It's an ancient soul. And an ancient soul is what separates you from being a corpse. The reason you're not dead is your soul. And when you exhale your last breath, you become a corpse. So everything that is different between you now and you after you're a corpse is in your psyche, your breath. The sum total of the difference is there. There's nothing to do with heaven or hell or God or any of those things. This is the ancient concept of a psyche, and the idea is that your soul is stamped with your character, your ethos, and that's why it's your soul and not somebody else's soul. What it means is the reason that you behave differently from other people in distinctive ways that someone can, like, I get to know the sort of comments Stephen might make or the kind of comments Phil might make or Sharon, and I get to know those things over time because each of you has your own distinctive character, your ethos, stamped onto your psyche. Your psyche has that distinctive shape to it. And it causes you to be interested in certain kinds of things, to notice certain kinds of things. And the things that you notice and take an interest in, you're likely to want to talk about and comment on. And what one of you says is going to be different from what another of you says. And that's, we can learn these things about each other, but we have to learn it indirectly. All right, so far so good. Psyche, ethos, arete, hieros. Hieros is a critical concept that I didn't fully appreciate until I read Cornford's book From Religion to Philosophy. And it's emphasized a little more in briefly in Thucydides' Myth Historicus, but it's mainly in that other work. And the idea is this. Contrary to the modern world's idea, you don't get to do anything you want. You don't. There are things you shouldn't do. Now, there's an open question whether you know what are the things you should and shouldn't do. And for Homo sapiens, our lack of an ethos that's tied, so irrevocably to the direction of vitality and health means that, animals might not be able to put into words what they should or shouldn't do, but they're able to notice and do those things more consistently than we are. We have a greater ability to comment on what we imagine we should or shouldn't do, but we have a far inferior ability to detect whether we're right. First of all, what should we or shouldn't we do in actuality? And second of all, even if we know that something is the right thing to do, we have a tendency to keep forgetting to do it. We just lose track of these things. But there's a slipperiness to health and vitality for Homo sapiens. So hieros is based on this idea that most things you don't have the privilege to do. And one of the reasons that you don't have the privilege is that you're incompetent. I will never be an anesthesiologist. And even if I studied the remainder of my life to be as good an anesthesiologist as I could, I will never be as good an anesthesiologist as Sharon, who's been doing it her whole life. She's got a lifetime of experience that makes her arete associated with anesthesiology far superior to anything I'll get to in the remaining decades I have left. It's just not possible for me. And if I don't study it, I really shouldn't be doing anesthesiology. I'm just going to kill people if I do, right? The Greeks had this idea that people, each person or clan, which is what Cornford talks about in From Religion to Mythology, has its area of life that it's good at. There might be a clan that's about carpentry. There might be a clan that's about fishing. To do the Sami, they're divided into the coastal Sami that do fishing. We're talking Finland, that do fishing, and the inland mountain Sami who herd reindeer. We've all heard of the reindeer herding people of Finland. Those are the mountain Sami. And these two clans, if you will, I don't know that the Sami consider them clans, but Cornford would. These two clans have different ways of life. If you grew up in the fishing clan, you're really good at fishing. You learn what you have to do to take care of the nets. You learn how to gauge when it's a bad time to go out on the water. You learn how to fix your boats. You learn how to gauge where the fish will be and when they won't be there and so on. All those things you get good at, but it doesn't teach you shit about reindeer herding, right? Just because you're a Sami doesn't mean that you learn reindeer herding. The reindeer herding clan, they learn all the things you have to know about the cycles of life of the reindeer, what they can tolerate and what they can't tolerate, how they respond to the seasons, how you can make, the tools and the implements and the clothing that you need from them. But they don't know jack shit about fishing. That's not their way of life. They don't have the experience and knowledge. They haven't developed the arete of fishing to the level that the fishing clan of Sami have done. They're two different clans. And Cornford postulates that in the early stages of Proto-Greek culture, there was a clan system in which each clan was responsible for a different contribution to the tribe. Right? Some of them might be good at herbalism. Some of them might be good at agriculture. Some of them would have been very good at herding goats and sheep and cattle and the like. And some of them would have been warriors, right? There's a variety of different ways of life. And the tribe needs all of these ways of life together for the tribe to be a going concern. But it doesn't mix and match and say anybody can be anything. They used to have a clear division of labor where you got taught the secrets of the clan if you were in that clan. And the clan, just like you have an ethos and Homo sapiens has an ethos, and you inherit the Homo sapiens ethos and your personal character stamped atop it, in the same way, each clan has an ethos, right? So if you are born a member of the reindeer herding Sami, then you have the Homo sapiens ethos, and stamped on top of that is the Sami ethos, and stamped on top of that is the reindeer herding clan ethos, and then stamped on top of that is your personal ethos. And there might be more levels. There might be, families, character and so on. But there's these layers of addition that happen that gradually make you a specific person within a specific context. And that context determines what your aretes will be. In the modern world, we talk so much about freedom, we forget to talk about attachment, right? Just because you potentially could do anything doesn't mean you can do anything. In fact, you're going to have limited amount of time to learn how to do things. If you want to be really good at something, you have to pick a few things and focus in on those things. And only there will you develop your arete. Furthermore, if you have to develop everything from scratch by trial and error, you're never going to get good at anything. You need to be born into a culture that already is pretty good at this. So that that Queen song, I swear that was running through my head, Stephen. I want it all. I want it now. So, modern, they want it all and they want it now. But the truth is, you need the support of a group of people who are already excellent, who already have developed the arete that you want to develop. So they will invest the time and energy in you to train you up to have that arete. And in the process of doing that, the other parts of you are going to atrophy and be left behind. Maybe in some other life, you could have been a great, commercial airline pilot. But no, you're a reindeer herder. And, thank goodness, because you're living in the mountains of Finland. It's not going to do you a lot of good to have the skill to fly airplanes around when you can't feed yourself or clothe yourself or do any of the things you need to be able to do. You need the arete that suits your circumstances, just like the cheetah on the Serengeti, right? That same cheetah in Antarctica is a losing proposition. It needs to be where the gazelles are. This context is everything. This modern notion of absolute freedom to be anything or do anything leaves people in an infantilized state in which they don't actually get good at anything. They become pacified. So what Aristotle's talking about is even in the height of classical Greece, every polis is made up of different tribes that have come together to form the polis. Every tribe is made up of different clans, and every clan has its distinctive aretes. So that people raised within those clans, instead of developing some other set of aretes, they develop that specific set of aretes by default, if things go well. So hieros is the privilege to do those things that you are competent to do. those things associated with your arete, those things associated with your way of life. It's the privilege to do those things and not to do other things that are not your yeras. Right? Reindeer herders aren't going to be great fishermen. Fishermen aren't going to be great reindeer herders. They can try to overlap, they can try to multitask. Maybe they'll do a reasonable job of it. But the greatest fishermen are going to be the ones that do it full time and focus on it, and they've mastered it because that's what they've put all their energy into. And the result of Yaris, Yaris implies an opposite, which is the lack of privilege to do the things you're not supposed to be doing. This is not a problem for the cheetah. The cheetah doesn't want to herd reindeer and doesn't want to fish. It doesn't notice the things in its environment that it could collect to become a good reindeer herder or a good fisherman. It doesn't pay the right kinds of attention to the world. The structure of its intelligence militates against it having the privilege to do those things. Homo sapiens is very flexible. So we are constantly noticing things that we're not any good at. In the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey talks about the difference between the circle of concern, which is all the things that interest you, and the circle of influence, which is all the things you can actually do something about. And he says the circle of influence is much smaller than the circle of concern. And in general, what we notice, oh, Sharon knows what I'm talking about. In general, what we notice is, and this is true, I learned this from martial arts as well. If you focus on working inside of your circle of influence, Stephen Covey says this, your circle of influence grows. If you work your bicep a lot, your bicep gets bigger. If you do math problems a lot, your ability to do math gets bigger. The way that we're structured is whatever you put your time and energy into, that's the thing you get better at. However, if you try to act outside your circle of influence, in your circle of concern, if you act on the things that you care about but aren't any good at and don't know how to do, first of all, you'll be incompetent because you don't know what the hell you're doing. But second of all, your circle of influence will shrink. Your ability to change the world goes down because while you're busy futzing around, screwing around with something that you don't know how to do, you're not spending the time developing the things you do know how to do. Your muscles atrophy, your knowledge, you start to forget things. If you don't speak Spanish, then week by week, month by month, you'll gradually lose the ability to speak Spanish. This is what he's talking about. And this is what they're talking about. And so this issue of Yeras is closely, so the reason that it's your Yeras is because it's where you've put your time and energy and where you've developed from your culture the capacity to do those things and developed an arete. And as a result, you're likely to not fuck it up too bad when you do that thing. Whereas if you act outside of your Yeras, you're acting in your area of incompetence, right? Like a neurosurgeon who thinks he can be an anesthesiologist. He says, move aside, I'm the smartest guy in the hospital. Let me adjust these dials. And the next thing you know, he's killed a patient. His ego has gotten in the way. He has violated Yeras by acting where he doesn't have the privilege to do something. And the medical profession recognizes these issues and borrows them somewhat from Greco-Roman tradition and tries to actually put in place certification and systems of behavior to say, you know what, if you're incompetent at something, you shouldn't do it. If you want to change that competence, we have a path available for you to learn, and people will evaluate whether you've achieved competence. And when you're not a menace to yourself and the people around you, we'll let you begin to practice. But until that happens, hands off, right? And I cite this example of the medical profession because the Greeks believed that's how the whole world worked. And they thought that's what the gods did. They enforced all that. Yeah, we'll come to the Romans and Sophro Sune. Right now we're going to start with the Greeks and Sophro Sune. This is the Greeks, right? So the Greeks thought that the gods had divided up the cosmos, all of nature, into different parts, each of which belonged to a different deity. You may have heard the mythological story of the 3 brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, and they sit down together and they divide up the world among them. And they say, who's going to be in charge of which part? They say, well, first of all, none of us is in charge of the earth. Gaia's got that covered, right? Our grandmama, she's got the earth. So the other elements remaining are earth, fire, and water. Are air, fire, and water. We have to divide up air, fire, and water. And so Poseidon takes the water. And Hades takes the air, right? Souls, which go into the afterlife, into Hades, soul's psyche are our breath, they're air. And air was seen as cold and as possessing, psyches. And Hades is the god of psyches. And that's why he's the god of the afterlife. And then Zeus took fire, which they equated with lightning. Heraclitus is very clear about the equation of lightning and fire together. He considers the lightning to be, the proof of it. And more specifically, Zeus is the god of authority and of the hidden harmony that makes all of the cosmos work, right? He's the god that knows how all things are steered through all things. Kubernetes says Heraclitus, and you see in other places where part of the reason he's called the king of the gods is because he understands the importance of persuasion. He's not a titan. He's not trying to dominate the other gods through brute force. He's persuading them. He's intelligent. He has reason. He knows what they care about. He knows what they care about because he knows what their different divisions of the world are that each of them is responsible for. Just like human beings have hieros, which is the privilege to act in a certain part of life, the gods have time, T-I-M-E, time. And time is the part of the nature that god is responsible for. So the sea is Poseidon's time. And air, psyches, is the time of Hades, just like fire is the time of Zeus. And so it goes for the rest of them. Each of them has their time. And one of the most important concepts that's associated with both hieros and time, which are modeled on each other, is the idea of jealousy. The gods are jealous of their prerogatives. Poseidon does not want Zeus mucking about with the ocean, right? Zeus does not want Hades trying to throw lightning bolts around. Each of them has their thing, and they're jealous at a level that's hard for us to conceive of, because of course they're not gods in the Christian medieval sense, or in the Hebrew sense, or in the modern atheist sense. They're not any kind of god like that. They're aspects of nature. So they imagined that relations between people and the gods, and people and nature, and people and other people, these hieros issues, are similar to the question of the division of labor and who has the privilege to do what. And you do not, in the Greek worldview, you do not want to cross the lines, because that's what makes tragedy happen. When you reach outside of your proper part of life and begin messing around with things you have no business in. If you're Bellerophon and you get on the back of Pegasus and you try to fly to Olympus, you are trespassing upon the time of the gods. Olympus isn't heaven. It's not a great reward for good people. It's a place that's anathema to mortals. It's a place where only immortals can live, right? They don't have blood. They have ichor. They don't eat and drink, food and beverages. They have ambrosia and nectar, which are things that they might kill a human being, right? These are things it's an alien way of life. People can't really survive up there, and we don't belong up there, and the gods aren't having any of it. When I was a kid, I was always frustrated by the fact that they wouldn't let Bellerophon fly Pegasus to Olympus. I mean, why not? It's a place, and he can go there, and he's a hero. And don't heroes deserve rewards? I've been raised within the modernist post-medieval framework. It didn't make sense to me. But from the Greek perspective, the whole question is, do not screw things up by messing with the stuff that you're incompetent at. This is the core of Greek tragedy and the Greek way of life. And all of this is tied up in the concept of hieros. Do you or don't you have the privilege to act that way, to do those things, to live in that way? Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, something that was actually interesting is that, one of the distinguishing characteristics that human beings do have is their ability to communicate complex concepts like language. And so that ability, is a double-edged sword sometimes, in the sense that our ability to filter noise is limited. So the idea that, it is, it's the intellect's a gift, and that you can manipulate reality, and these are ideas that then can manifest themselves physically. But at the same time, they, as you were mentioning, they put thoughts into our head that have us focusing on what we don't have. Right. So that's where this desire that is actually somewhat irrational is that it's putting something in our head. And this is like consumerism in a nutshell. I mean, in a sense. So in a way, it's kind of, this is just highlighting the importance of the idea of having principles and maintaining your character within that. And not only maintaining your principles, but the intellectual humility that comes along with what is you're being exposed to. Because if you're being exposed to something new, you have to make a decision on whether or not that's good or not, to actually act on. And yeah, I mean, we seem to not necessarily have, we struggle with that. I'll just say that. So some of the constraints that exist within nature are actually, that drive excellence in a way. It's much simpler. It's a much more simple formula. Now, obviously, yeah, we're much more complex, but anyway, I was just thinking about it in terms of how our intellect and our language and our ability to communicate, and how filtering out noise is kind of limited, and how that can create the illness that you were talking about a little bit earlier, with was it Karas?
Karas.
Yeah. So yeah, anyway, it's just it's interesting to think of it from that perspective, because yeah, there's reason for humility. I'll just say that.
Yes. These are great comments, Joe. Thank you. Yeah, what's interesting about this is that, and this is why I got so excited about Thucydides Mythostoricus as a book, is when you start to see all the pieces and how they fit together, you realize how coherent this model of the human condition that the ancient Greeks had is. It can explain a great deal that we are incompetent to explain to this day. We're very good at making machines, but we're very hard at explaining. We have a hard time understanding when you should or shouldn't use those machines, right? We're sort of like, I don't know if anybody's played Magic the Gathering. It's a card game, a fantasy card game that my wife helped bring into production. It's famous now, but it's full of fantasy characters, and one of them are goblins. And goblins are very smart but incredibly foolish. They can make balloons that fly, but they fly way too high until they run out of fuel, and then they fall out of the sky like rocks and they die. They make guns, that they can use to shoot their opponents, but randomly the guns blow up and blow them up. That they're constantly doing clever but foolish things. And in some ways, that's Homo sapiens, right? And especially moderns. We're more goblin-like than the ancients were. The ancients were very worried about where should we go and where should we not go? What are the things we should do and what are the things we should not do? Whereas moderns sort of believe we can do anything. I mean, unless it's illegal or you'll get in trouble. And of course, that's solvable. Just get rich and change the laws, and now it's okay. Literally everything is okay as long as you buy enough senators to change the laws. This is the lack of ethos of modernity, is that nothing really matters. It's just a might makes right sort of scenario with a systematic way of gauging what's currently right. So along with the concept of hieros is the concept of ethea, which is related to the concept of ethos. And your ethea is the proper range of behavior or way of life for your ethos, arete, hieros character. So each clan has its ethea, which is the range of behavior that it should be engaged in. It should be engaged in those things on the one hand, because that's how the tribe survives. If one of the clans stops doing its part of what the tribe needs, the tribe begins to fall apart. I mean, what if the carpenter stopped building houses? Now nobody has anywhere to live. If the herbalist stopped collecting herbs and making medicines, first time somebody gets sick, they die. I mean, it's every clan has this role it's supposed to play in order to keep the whole healthy. And the same is true in the modern world. We just say it differently. But we don't mind busting up the athea of different professions if we think it'll make a quick buck this decade for our corporation. We're constantly destroying industries and wrecking training programs because we think we can save a few bucks and improve our bottom line. Even though in the long run, having incompetent carpenters and electricians and incompetent aircraft engineers means that we're going to fall out of the skies sometimes when we wouldn't have otherwise. But we're goblins, we don't care. At least we made a buck today. You know, the ancient Greeks never would have done that because they understood that if you wreck the athea of some essential clan, you're taking the whole polis apart. You can't do that. You just can't do it. So they were obsessed with athea. And if your clan or you as a person have a certain athea, which is the things you should be doing, that athea defines your yeras. What are the privileges that you have? What are the things you're allowed to do? You're allowed to do those things because we need you to do those things. Okay. So that takes us into these terms. If we think about these not in a generic way, but tied to the earlier terms, we start to see the real meaning that's intended by words like sophron. So sophron is typically defined as being conscious of your limits and keeping your head, right? Do you know the boundaries of your athea? Do you know what you have yeras for and what you don't have yeras for? Do you know what your arete or your aretes are? And do you know how far developed they are so that you know what's outside your reach and what's within your reach? Do you understand your own ethos enough to know what possible aretes you could or couldn't develop? Do you know if you have perfect pitch or if you always sing off key? I mean, have you noticed where your limits are? Yeah, Boeing. That's why I'm talking about aircraft dropping out of the skies, right? Boeing cut a lot of corners in the way that they did construction because they thought, the business people thought it would make them a lot of money, and the result is they wrecked their engineering culture by outsourcing everything all over the world to people who were going to do one-off work to make the latest airplane. And of course, they never worked together before. They didn't work together this time. They all worked separately in their separate countries, making pieces that then didn't fit together very well. And then nobody had oversight over the whole thing. So it's not a surprise that planes are dropping out of the skies. Sophron, do you know those limits? And we can relate this to last week's discussion. We said phylaktos means guarded. You're on guard. You know about your weaknesses and you're watching out for whether something is trying to invade you, whether some care is trying to invade you and bring nosos because it knows your weaknesses. So, I'm sure I have parts of my character where I'm blind, where I have aphylactos. I'm unguarded. I don't know those weaknesses. So I don't know to be cautious about them. But, the example I always cite is my alcoholism. The reason I've never spent, a day in the bottle as an adult is because I know about this genetic weakness. I'm on guard. I have phylactos about this one weakness. I know there's a care waiting for me that wants to bring a nosos, and it will if I drop my guard. So I try in this one limited respect, I have sophron. When it comes to my alcoholism, it's one of the best parts of my life as far as being on top of things. I have sophron about this thing. But God knows what else I have that I don't have sophron about. I don't have complete sophron because I don't have complete self-knowledge. Gnothi seauta, know thyself. They're saying figure out your character and learn where your strengths and weaknesses are so that you can be on guard about your weaknesses. And so that you know to cultivate your character, both to improve your strengths into aretes, and maybe you can shore up your weaknesses. If they're not genetic, maybe if they're just behavioral or cultural, maybe you can shore them up and they'll stop being weaknesses and you'll stop being vulnerable. But all of that requires that you pay attention, that you know yourself, and that you know this is the most important thing to do to avoid catastrophe in your life. There's plenty of things that could cause catastrophe in your life that are outside your control. Contingency, right? Joe always tells us about agency versus contingency. But if those are things you can't control, then they're in your circle of influence, your circle of concern, but not in your circle of influence. So you're wasting your time worrying about them. Focus on the things that you can do something about, like your own character and the conditions, the immediate conditions of your life. And those things at least will improve. It doesn't help, if a volcano goes off underneath you, but nothing was going to anyway. But it can keep you from picking up a bottle if you've inherited the bad genes that I've inherited. And likewise, for the many people on this call that don't have the alcoholic gene, knowing they don't have it means they can pick up a bottle and it's no problem, right? They don't have to be on guard about that, but they know it, right? They know that it's safe to be on guard because they know themselves.
So you're a scientist, so you know that because you have went through your genes to find that out, or how do you know that?
Well, in my case, it's because every adult member of my family, going back 3 generations on every side, spent years in the bottle. I'm the only one who didn't. It's only because I never picked up the bottle. So,
you don't know that. If you never picked it up, you don't know. You may be the only one that doesn't have that gene, right? Is that a correct statement?
This one, as far as we know, is recessive. If both your parents have it, you have it. And both my parents spent a long time, over a decade each, in the bottle. My mom died still drinking. So I don't have any doubts.
Okay, I now I understand.
Yeah. My maternal grandmother drank her entire life and periodically ended up homeless, literally in the gutter in downtown Seattle, outside of bars, where she got arrested over and over and over because she couldn't put the bottle down. All of it. My paternal grandfather used to hide bottles of alcohol everywhere in the house. He'd hide them in the garage. He'd hide them in the car. He'd hide them in the woodshed. He hid them in the garden. They were everywhere. My grandma used to pay us when we were little kids a nickel for every one of Grandpa's bottles of alcohol we collected and brought to her so she could dump them out. So it's sort of like, my family, there's no ambiguity. It's not like they occasionally had trouble with drink. It's that, they lived in the bottle. So, this is a test I don't need to run. It continued on unfortunately, into my siblings' generation too. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, I think that the comment that actually Stephen made in the chat is worth mentioning, is that, the cultural mind seeks to improve itself, to seek that which is good outside of itself and weed out that which is bad within itself. The cultural Philistine's mind, however, believes it does not need to improve itself, for everything within itself is good and thus needs no weeding, while everything outside itself is misguided and thus deserves no seeking. That's a very good quote. I mean, it really is on a number of levels, because the one thing is that you were alluding to this earlier, is that we kind of get caught in our own narrative and internally. And when we're caught in that narrative, that it probably makes for a good tragedy. I mean, in the sense that we're only thinking about our perspective on the world. And this is, the world is, it's about me. And so that idea of being able to look outside is then you have to ask yourself, what is good, right? And then what is good is someone else, is, your relationships is what you're trying to cultivate. And that's being able to consider what else is going on in their lives, right? And then what is really good is when you realize that you don't know what's going on in their minds or what they have going on. Thus, you really ought to withhold judgment. So that comes back to the whole point of cultivating your own personal character, because that's something not only that you can control, but it's also the only way that you kind of really have that humility that I was talking about a little bit earlier. You demonstrate that humility that allows you to have better relationships, but also this is where it's its own reward in the sense that there's a certain degree of tranquility that comes with that. And so there's a peacefulness, as opposed to making the assumption that somebody is screwing you. Oh, they cut in front of you in line. Oh, they're screwing me. It's me that they're screwing, not anybody else. You know, and it's like, and so that idea of what is, you know, understanding the weed out, what is actually bad within, is essentially recognizing that that there are things outside of you that are going on that are a hell of a lot worse than what are, you know, than what you're maybe experiencing. So that ability to be able to contemplate that kind of gets you outside of yourself so that you and your interactions become a lot more healthy.
Yes.
You know, so you don't necessarily, and that's where ethics comes in, and you don't necessarily go down to the lowest common denominator.
Right. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, that's a great concept. It's important. It is important for us to understand the extent to which, you know, the development of Sophron, and I'm going to use a couple examples here. You know, so we've got kittens. I call them kittens. They're 2 years old. They're not kittens anymore. Nobody would call them a kitten, but we still call them kittens, and it's because our other kitty, you know, who's sitting on my lap right now, she's 18 years old. She's been around the block, right? So she really knows her limits very well. And as an elderly kitty, she's developing arthritis. So there are a lot of jumps she can't do anymore that she used to be able to do, and she doesn't try. Every so often, when her capacity diminishes further, she misses a jump, and then she withdraws it from her repertoire and doesn't try it anymore. She's kind of in a period in her life where her circle of influence is shrinking because her body is unraveling. But generally speaking, she has much better sophron than these two young cats. We got these young cats when they were kittens young enough that they still did not know what they could do and what they couldn't do. And more importantly, their bodies were still growing. So it's through the process of play and practice that they develop their arete. They learn, and not just learn mentally, but they learn physically. Their muscles learn. You know, martial arts talks about muscle memory and so on. Their muscles, their joints, their ligaments, their tendons, their bones all learn. Their circulatory system, their lung capacity learns what they need to be able to do to support the cat's interest in jumping. And over time, so at first, the kittens miss a lot of jumps when they're really young. It is hilarious to have little kittens and be playing with them because they get all kinds of things wrong. They constantly are. They used to jump on the couch and they try to land on the back of the couch sideways in defiance of gravity, and then they would be surprised when they fell off. This is like, who knew there was a thing called gravity? Why can't I stand sideways? Why do I always have to stand upright or nothing? It didn't make sense to them, right? They had to learn their limits by practice. And of course, their limits were constantly changing because they were growing and becoming more proficient. But they've got to the point now where they don't fall off of things nearly as often as they used to. Age 2, right? But they still don't entirely have it all figured out. They're still learning things. And so you can watch a species that has a far greater sophrosune than Homo sapiens has, developing its sophron, learning what its limits are at. And it doesn't know, these cats don't know anything about what their limits might be as far as learning Latin or, you know, target practice with a rifle. Not because they're incapable of doing those things, but because no part of them wants to do those things. They don't notice those things. They don't take an interest in those things. They don't feel anything about those things. You were talking about signal and noise earlier. Those things are all just noise to them. When they look around a room, they don't see the things in the room that would support those activities. but they see everything in the room that would support the activities associated with their ethea and where their hieros and arete lie. You know, they notice things like that. They notice a little bug on a window long before Beverly or I notice it. And not only do they notice it, they drop whatever they're doing and race over to the window. Oh my God, a bug, a bug, a bug, a bug, a bug. Oh my God, a bug. They usually have it out within 6 seconds. They're the fastest bug killers we've ever owned. They're obsessed with bugs. Nothing can keep their interest beyond that. But in order to pursue the bug, they had to learn to run. They had to learn to look around. They had to learn to notice those things that are part of their ethea. And they had to develop both the capacity, the arete, and the sophron to know when is the bug too high to jump for. You know, which jumps can they make and which jumps can they not make. And at this point, they're pretty good at it, which is funny considering a year and a half ago, they were terrible at it. I mean, they were just terrible. So I don't mean to portray a utopian vision of other species as just like having perfect understanding of this. They have to learn it just like we learn things. But they take an interest in those parts of life that are related to their ethea and their arete. And that keen interest is very focused on figuring out what they can accomplish and what they can't accomplish. We have trouble with this. Our species has a lot of trouble in this area. Go ahead, Joe. I see you came off mute.
Yeah, really quickly. I mean, in a sense that they have that those limits are kind of preventing them from having unhealthy desires.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah, so it's really something where, and I've always noticed that the more I try and control, right, which is a desire, the worse things get.
There's
right?
limits to what we can control.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a curve there.
Yes.
I mean, the more controlling, even the more controlling people that I know,
Yes.
you know, even somebody cuts in front of you, you want to control what they do, right? You're upset because of what they did, not, you know, but it's this element, the more you want that and the worse it gets. Like just, and even myself dealing with death or things like that. Yeah, I want to control it. I don't want somebody to die, well, which is natural. But knowing that the intellect that actually can predict that that's going to happen is where the anxiety is kind of coming from. And the wanting to control that is actually the worst part, right?
Yes.
So
yes. Yeah, and this goes to the heart of the issue that's being raised by the succession of terms. Psyche, ethos, arete, hieros, ethea, sophron. What we're building up here is a picture in which there's a very complex relationship between the individual and the world, and also between the individual and the larger group. And the Greeks have a model for all of this and how it works and why some individuals or groups succeed while other individuals or groups fail. We really have no model at all for it in the modern world. Our idea is that we're machines and our brains are computers, and you fill them with information through some sort of weird passive education, and then we become wise and know things and do things. And this is like a child's cartoon of a model of human behavior. And then when it comes to things like freedom and obligations, what are our duties? What should we be focusing on? Again, we have like a child's caricature. The modern world has just weirdly stripped down simplistic line drawing level understanding of, you know, what we're supposed to do. We even deny that there's anything we're supposed to do. You do anything you want to as long as you have the money and, you know, don't get in trouble for it. And that's about it as far as the modern world's concerned. So okay, so we talked about sophron. And sophron is a critical concept. Aristotle talks about it, Heraclitus talks about it, Plato talks about it. The philosophers are obsessed with the issue of sophron. Now, modern definitions of sophron tend to focus on moderation. You can find many different definitions of sophron around the internet that equate it with moderation. Just don't do anything to extremes and you'll be fine. Go to the center of the herd and avoid the periphery, right? This is our rewriting of what sophron must mean. Some sort of, we also do it as be rational. Sophron to a modern means don't have any strong feelings. Strong feelings are scary. They make bad things happen. But as we know, nobody ever, you know, caused a Holocaust for intellectual, ideological reasons. They did it because they felt angry and hatred. And so if you just don't feel anger and hatred, then, you know, you won't cause a Holocaust, which of course is absolutely false. But that's our model of how these things happen. Feelings are scary and anything extreme is scary. So just Be calm and rational, and surely goodness will follow you the rest of your life. That's our cartoon version of Sophron. And it's so far apart from knowing how does your species survive? How does it fit into the world? What are the things you should do and shouldn't do? How do you know where health and vitality lie? How do you deal with the fact that we're so possessed by enthusiasms that we're easily distracted from the things we should do and instead get obsessed about things that we shouldn't do and push them, to the point of self-destruction? All of these issues to the Greeks are bound up with the meaning of Sophron, but to moderns, we just erase all that stuff as background noise because we don't have a concept of what is the reason a species exists, what is its arete, what is the way of life, that the ethea that's supposed to go with that. We're missing all of those things, and without those things, Sophron makes no sense to us. So we just replace it with some other meaning that makes sense to us.
So what you're saying is that if a person has a natural, if someone interprets something different than what your mind is constructing, that interpretation is more important than what your mind is forming. So you have to behave a certain way, or you're going to be called Hitler. Is that a correct statement?
Well, it kind of means something related to that, but a little different.
Okay.
And I'm not talking about my value system, but kind of what do the ancient Greeks think? So what the ancient Greeks thought is that of the huge variety of things that people could do, some of them are more likely to lead to a healthy species, a healthy culture, and even a healthy individual than other things. So for example, if I become addicted to lighting off bigger and bigger fireworks, sooner or later I'm going to blow off a finger or a thumb, or I'm going to break the law and get in trouble. And that obsession, is a problem because it doesn't lead me in the direction of vitality. A simpler example is, I've been a medical software programmer for 40 years, among other things. And a very common problem that I've had is when I'm deep in the programming of a piece of software, I forget what time it is. I forget where I am. I forget what I'm feeling. I sit down at 8 in the morning. This is on the golden age, back in the 90s when I was doing this stuff. I'd sit down and start programming at 8 in the morning, and then I'd look up and it'd be 5:30 at night. I should have gone home an hour ago, and I forgot to eat lunch. I forgot to take breaks. I forgot to go to the bathroom. My bladder's full and I'm really uncomfortable. But I didn't notice any of that because my grasp on, as a Homo sapiens, my grasp on the core processes of my body and my health is tenuous. Sometimes I notice the things that matter, and sometimes I forget about them and I completely lose track of them. And that's not something I ever see my cats do. When it's time to use the litter box, they go. They get up and leave, and it doesn't matter what they're in the middle of. They're very strongly attached to the direction of health. And Homo sapiens is only loosely attached to the direction of health. So what the Greeks were trying to do is, among other things, they were trying to catalog what are all the different ways of life that work for us. And, hoping that people would do those things and not neglect them, in favor of, the Alcibiades, for example, is famous in Greece for being this incredibly beautiful, charismatic guy who led a lot of people into trouble. And eventually he had to be exiled from Athens because he wouldn't stop causing trouble. He kept getting the kids in trouble. He helped to egg on the worst parts of the Peloponnesian War. He had this chaos in him that kept not only leading himself, but leading all of Athens astray and into trouble. And they finally figured out the only way we're going to stop doing this is if we get this guy. He can live anywhere but here. This is what they ended up deciding. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but it's related, right?
Yes, and I think I spoke up and Sharon had her hand up, so sorry about that, Sharon.
Go ahead, Sharon.
That's all right. That's all right. So I want to say something in defense of moderns.
Yeah, sure.
I find all these definitions of the elements of character very interesting. But I am beginning to see or think, and please correct me, that they're all interrelated, the gerus, the ethea, and the sophron. And why? Because the way I understand things is I have to be practical And that's why I questioned the definition of phronesis, because I thought it had changed. So about 2 weeks ago, or about a week ago, we watched a president struggle with Garis, Ethia, and Sofran. And ultimately, he came to the decision which told him that he was now no longer, like about your cat, as she develops arthritis, she can't jump anymore. He was now 81, and he no longer had the, maybe mental, but no longer the physical capacity for this exercise, right? And I think that demonstrated character. But in the speech in which he gave as he was leaving, he asked, does character matter anymore?
Right.
And I think when the Greeks were putting these societies together and their definition of aristoi, I think the individuals that had the elements of these most defined were the ones who rose to the top. And in the earlier parts of this call, you were talking about who deserved to be a slave or not. I think the Greeks thought. But I think in our society, people who, I hate to say don't achieve, but people who don't excel in character, and not only in money, but in character, and develop contentment with their place in this world, is because they don't do the work. And I think that's where we are in society. And all these elements take a lot of work. They do not, whether you're born with good character or not. And if you're born with good character, further development gives you a fine character. And if you're born with poor character, it's not the end of the world. You can still work on it, because I'm the eternal optimist.
Yes. Certainly the Greeks thought that too. Yeah.
Yes. So I find this very, very interesting, but I think elements of all of these are in all of us, but at different levels of development.
Yes. That's what the Greeks thought. Yeah. Right on, Sharon. And I don't mean to say that in the modern world nobody has any character, but I mean to say that ancient culture was obsessed with character and wouldn't shut up about it. And all these issues they talk, you can hardly get Aristotle to start writing on any subject at all. Within, a few sentences, he's bringing up character again. It was like, it doesn't take him long to say, it could be about politics or epistemology. And the next thing you know, Aristotle's saying, man by nature, i.e. by his character, desires to know. He's constantly referencing character. Whereas in the modern world, when somebody does what Biden did, which is what you're alluding to, and says, I have enough Sofron to see that my limits have shrunk and I can't do this job anymore. I shouldn't run for president. We're all shocked. I mean, it's admirable, right? I mean, it's amazing. But most politicians, part of why it's amazing is most of the politicians we're familiar with would never do anything like that. They would always just run until the bitter end. That's like usually how these things go. So when we see something like that, or like, what FDR did, with his polio, during World War II and so on. When we see people acting with such intense character, we both admire them, and we also get a sense that we're in the presence of there's some old mysterious thing at work here that we're not very familiar with, because we might wish there was more of it in the world, but we recognize the rarity of it. It's not the norm. If you read law codes in the United States and you look at how various crimes are to be punished, you'll see they almost never refer to character. It's almost always by rote recipes. So when Martin Luther King Jr. says, he dreams of his children growing up in a world that doesn't judge people by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, he's suggesting that society ought to be organized in a way that's conscious of character, in which character matters, and in which you don't treat, the Dalai Lama the same way that you treat Jeffrey Dahmer. They're not equals, right? You evaluate people on the basis of what they've shown you and how they prove to behave. Someone who's an inveterate liar or con artist is not to be given the same level of acceptance into a discussion that I would give you, right? I would much rather hear from you than from a con artist, right? But the law treats you as identical because character is invisible to the law. The same as the economy. You know, the amount that things cost it doesn't relate to character. The privileges that people are granted doesn't relate to character. Our entire structure of our society, character might as well be invisible. We love it when it shows up, but we're not governed by it, which is a problem for us. That's all I mean to say. I don't mean to say moderns don't have it.
Okay. No, I was just, no, I in defense of moderns, I was just saying that we're probably not as concerned with it because it's not part of our daily discussion. But here's something that I've always wondered about. Individuals that do not take the time to develop character, you see them, the elements of character, you see them with a great deal of anxiety. So I started to wonder at some point in my career along the time, the relationship of this lack of emotional character development with any kind of psychopathology, aside from the genes. Of course, if you're born with schizophrenia, if you're born with a psychosis, that's a psychosis. But a neurosis is a little bit different. And so that's a question that I have that I still haven't answered. Joe kind of alluded to it, you know, about the needing to control and the needing to not rely, the needing to understand that you are in a framework of life and there are many things that are beyond your control. And back to, you talked about that book, Sphere of Influence.
Oh, yes, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
Exactly. That is a very, very, very key sentence, because I remember I read that book to my son, because that's where anxiety begins. Right at that point. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, let me just pop that into the chat. 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. There's some interesting stuff in there, but I really think the issue about the circle of influence and the circle of concern is among the best things in the book. It's a game changer. And for me, part of the reason I could recognize it is because it fits so well with what we learned in a traditional Okinawan dojo, which is, you know, there's nothing wrong with being a beginner. You're not an inferior person for being a beginner, but you have to have sofron. You have to know that there are certain things to be working on as a beginner that should be your focus. And there are other things that might look flashy and exciting that you should like put on a shelf and leave until later. And we learned why you do these things one step at a time, why you can't, it's not going to be safe to pick up the razor sharp comma and practice with it on day one. Probably not on day 365 either. You should work your way up to it through a lot of other things to where you have an enormous amount of control over your body and awareness of your surroundings before you ever pick up anything that dangerous. Because you make a mistake with it and you can't take the mistake back. You know, you lop off one of your own fingers and it's, you know, it doesn't matter that you didn't mean it. You still don't have the finger. There's consequences to these things. And so this idea of sofron and, you know, obsessively focusing on and being part of a community that has gone ahead of you and that can show you the way and how to, I mean, you know all this from your medical training, step by step. You learn things in a certain order because you can't learn the later things unless you've learned the early things first, because they open your eyes to understanding the values at stake in the later things. And then you can recognize why the later things matter. You know, this process of acculturation in Homo sapiens, I keep coming back to, I mean, it's one of the most exciting areas of evolutionary studies in Homo sapiens right now is the study of the evolution of the different stages of life that we go through. And the argument that even our closest kin among the great apes have fewer stages of development than we have, and that our stages of development directly imply a culture, that we're going to take care of our young for a longer period of time, and that they're going to go through different life stages at which they need to learn different lessons and take on different responsibilities. And you can now trace it directly to, you know, baby teeth versus permanent teeth describe stages of development, you know, that imply a certain culture and so on. It's fascinating stuff. And it's all about this question of limits. What are you ready for? What are you able to do? And how do you work on the early lessons to prepare yourself for the later lessons? This is like built into the life cycle and evolution of our species. So thanks for bringing that up, Sharon. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, this really comes out in your discussion with Sharon about character. But it seems to me the character is not only an important part of the development of the individual, but the character of the society is something that actually is ultimately the most important thing. Because if you don't, the society don't have the character, it doesn't have the structure of caring about the relationship of how the society harmonizes. And one of the things that's most important in a way is the idea of education. And if you do not have the proper educational structure, then in a sense you are not providing a structure to develop the character of the individual. And these days it seems to me like money is such an important thing, it's distorted everything. In other words, we used to think, even not that long ago, that being a teacher was a very, very important job because you're involved with the development of character of individuals and therefore, in a sense, unfolding the character of a society as such. But because we have such an infatuation with money, everybody who has talent in any way has left teaching. Like you almost consider a loser of your teaching, except maybe in a university, maybe that you still have that, okay? But even in the university, sometimes you don't have the best people because the best people are like research scientists or whatever they are, you know? I used to remember when I first started teaching, there was a thing about this teacher who taught at universities. He became so famous and world important that he was called away to all sorts of consultations, and he confronted the dean, like, I need more release time, right? So finally, he was released from teaching except one class, and he had an aide to help him teach. And it got to a point where he happened to be all around, never showing up. And one day he happened to have a consulting thing in the city that he was leaving that had something to do, that was very close to the university. So he decided to drop by and see what happened to the class. It was going okay. And it turns out what they did was they taped lectures. This was before computers, but they taped lectures of him giving lectures about this thing. And what happened was that the assistant was actually somebody who just set up the tape recorder, play videotape and the TV monitor, and therefore, and he just left. And when he looked into the class, he saw that yes, indeed, that was happening, but in every desk, there was a tape recorder on the desk taping the lecture that was given. I mean, there you go. You don't have the nuance of an individual thing. It's like, but the students were smart enough that, okay, you could do that. We could also leave the class and just tape record you.
You're not going to be here, neither are we.
That was very interesting. And so I think that that's a real weakness in developing the character of of the teachers, and even the professor who he's so busy he cannot even have one class, be in class. He just have a tape recording lecturing the content, which is supposedly good, I suppose, and then nothing happens, and there's no individual guidance at all whatsoever. That's it, Phil.
That's a great story, Phil. I'm not going to forget that anytime soon. Yeah, there it is in a nutshell. Lisa, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I have to interject with the idea of making mistakes. It's human. And if you're not making mistakes, you're not learning. And it appalls me that people have a position that has so much energy toward never making mistakes, that they are robots, and the look on they walk through life and with no face. They might as well have their head cut off because they're afraid of making mistakes. And that is horrible to buy into that. So I'm contradicting your statement about mistakes, because I love making mistakes.
Me too. I'm right there with you. I'm right there with you. And that means I'm not adequately describing the Greek perspective, because it's like the kittens had to make a lot of mistakes to develop their arete, right? And even when you have your powers at your peak, when you're the Greeks use the word fluoroite, even when you're at the peak of your powers, you're always going to be working close to the edges of your circle of influence, which means some of it's going to work and some of it's not. And you don't know where the line on that circle is. And we're mortals, to err as humans. So making mistakes it's just part of life. That's just got to be part of it.
So what you're saying is the flow. So you use the cats as an example. If you watch a cat, they're flowing. Holy chickens, they're flowing.
Yes.
And you're saying if you're trained enough, you flow.
Yes.
And they may fall off the table because they step wrong, but that's no big deal because they catch themselves in the flow.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm with you. I'm with you on that. And part of it too, which we've talked about before, but I don't think we've talked about today, is how much of arete is unconscious. And I often use the example, because we've got Sharon, I often use the example of med students versus experienced practitioners. Sharon's been an anesthesiologist for a long time. And when she goes into, to administer anesthesia during a surgery, she doesn't have to think about every little thing, because she's done it a million times before. She can save her conscious mind for what's distinctive about this patient. Are they a redhead? Do they have a certain history, unfortunate history? Do they have some allergies? She can focus on the things that are distinctive about this case and trust her unconscious to remember to follow through on the standard things that need to be done. She may have a checklist to make sure that her unconscious hasn't screwed up, but she's got this flow and proficiency that comes from not having to think about consciously about every little thing. By contrast, when you're very first learning about anesthesia and the very first times you're being called upon to practice, you don't have any experience at all behind you. Your unconscious can't supply any guidance for what you should do. You're really having to consciously make each decision, and the result is there's no flow, right? Because it's a challenge. You're having to muster your consciousness at every single moment and stop and go, I wonder what the right thing is to do here. I wonder what the right thing is to do there. It's the same with bicycling. You first get on the bicycle and you're overwhelmed by all the choices. How do you tell if you're upright? Should you turn the handlebars? Sit forward or sit back? Everything is like, but when you've been doing it for a while, your body, your muscle memory, and your unconscious, they automatically move you to the good center in which you can flow. And now it frees up your consciousness to think about things like, is there a car over there? Or, do I see glass in my path I should avoid? It makes you a smoother person. But the road to getting there is full of mistakes. That's how we I often say in my industry, medical software, the people who are the best at medical software, who I admire the most, are the ones who've made the most mistakes. So, other people might reason their way into blunders that these guys would never do because they've already made those blunders. They know where that path leads. They don't need to say, I wonder what happens if I do X. Like, well, I did X and it was a disaster. On the other hand, if we go this other way, it'll be very easy and things will go well and we'll save patients' lives and so on. So there's a level at which, making mistakes and also developing your unconscious, building up your character through experience and the experience of making mistakes and having successes, that's really what leads us to developing our arete. It's definitely not about perfection for us, not for Homo sapiens at any point. So I commend what you said totally. Sharon, come off mute. Tell us. Oh, you're off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
So Lisa, my little triangle is mistakes, experience, judgment. When you develop judgment, that's where the beginning of your arete is. So mistakes are an essential part of living. You're right. So I want to agree with something that Phil said, that not only is the character of the individual important, but the character of the society is also very, very important. And when I was away, I read a book by an economist called What We Owe Each Other and What Do We Owe in Return? And how different societies set up their social contracts is one of the fascinating things I notice as I travel around. We in America have a very porous social contract. Is it a reflection of our character? That's a question that I don't know. But this book led me to start reading or to finally digest Hannah Arendt's A Human Condition. Right, because that was a very dry read for me. And I read parts of it once or twice and didn't get it. But when I approached it, she talks about labor, work, and action. And that's the main themes of the book. And they're all interactive. But when I look at that from the position of a social contract, what we owe each other, and in turn, what do we owe to our society? The foundation of that is, I think, is character. I want you to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Certainly, Kenneth Smith often says, a society without any Aristoi can't develop any Aristoi. And Donald talks about this. He quotes Kenneth Smith often about this, that the best way to become an Aristos is not to read a book, and it's not to self-congratulate yourself and claim to be one. You have to follow an Aristos around and find out what it's like to be one. That's certainly what it's like in traditional martial arts. If you get a great sensei and you practice with them, part of what you're doing is going through the motions and making mistakes and learning. But part of what you're doing is watching somebody who's really great and seeing what it's like to live like that person. And experiencing that teaches you more about martial arts than you can ever learn by yourself. And I say that as somebody who's tried both ways multiple times. I've done a lot of self-study. But let me tell you, I can think that I've got a kata down pat, and I get into a Zoom class with somebody who's a real master, and it's like seconds into the kata, and he's pointing out things that I can do better, and why they're done better, and why that movement exists. And I start to realize I was aping the outward form of the thing, but without the experience of working with a master, I never got to learn the inner essence of it. What is it all about? What does it all mean? How does it flow, to use Lisa's terminology, within the larger structure? And that's cultural, right? That's a cultural effect to be I guess I want to say it's a dialectic, right? This is one of the places moderns really struggle is, what are the rights of the individual and what are the rights of the group? And the ancient Greeks said, well, they're both important and you can't compromise. So what you need to do is create a dialectic. You need to create a dialectic where each of them is resisting and also helping the other, just like the string and the wood of a bow. And the result is you get a dynamic system out of that in which people can really, maximize their gifts and also do the best for society. But short of that, all the sort of simplistic, either it's all about the group or it's all about the individual stuff, neither of them really gets us out of the starting gate. So I'm with you about this. The character of the larger culture sort of sets the frame for what it's possible. Or maybe I want to say for what it's easy or difficult for the individual to grow into. So if your school has no music classes, your gift of music that you might have been lucky enough to be born with, it may or may not go anywhere. But if you are lucky enough to be born to musical parents or to go to a school that's got music classes, then your gift of music that you were born with might flourish like crazy. It all depends. But it's much harder if you don't have the larger supporting structure of the society. That's, I guess, kind of Kenneth's point about Aristoi. And I think the Greeks would say it's the same about arete. Even most animals, I mean, there are non-social animals, but even most animals really benefit from having experienced elders. Elephants, for example, learn an enormous amount about the terrain of Africa and the changes of the seasons and when a water hole has water and when it doesn't. They learned that from their grandmas. They aren't just prodigies who magically figure all these things out, because some of these experiments are deadly. You try to cross the Great Desert and you think there's going to be water and there's not, and next thing you know, there's a corpse. But your grandma encourages you not to go until the right season, and then you go and there's a water course and you survive, and then you can pass it on to the others. The cultural element is every bit as important as the rest of it. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, well, we have to work on this new university course called alcohol studies. But I was just going to say that alcoholism, as widespread as we can have in the modern times, wasn't such an issue a few centuries ago because alcohol was expensive. Or you might have a farmer who might be able to make his own supply, but even that's going to have limitations. You'll probably end up drinking your way through it. But ordinary common people didn't have the money to get drunk. It was just too expensive. Now, things changed with industrialization. In the 18th century, famously, they found out how to make cheap spirits, like the English like gin. Okay, now alcoholism was no longer just the preserve of the rich or even the middle class. The poor industrial worker could just afford enough to drink themselves stupid. So a modern phenomenon. Thank you.
Boy, that's a great point, Stephen. Thank you. Yeah, it's Chaucer has jokes in the Canterbury Tales about most alcoholics being monks, because the monasteries, would have part of their grounds were devoted to alcohol, so they had readier access to it than the average layperson. And the result was if you weren't rich and you weren't a monk, you probably couldn't ever express any genes for alcoholism that you might have. It's a marvelous thing. There also, if you go way back, like to pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon culture, alcohol was a sacred drug, not a mundane drug. It was to be used in specific rites and rituals, like I think we've talked before about the ritual around the table where you get everybody to tell about what they've done for the people in the past and what do they promise to do in the future. And the whole thing was used to expose and deflate braggarts, right? What you say when you're under control is one thing, but what do you say when you're drunk? If we get you drunk on mead wine, do you start bragging about all these great things that you did that actually somebody else did, and you start making grandiose promises? And if you do, you've done it in public in front of your peers, and now they know they can't trust you. And so it's good for society. they learn not to put their faith in the people who are sort of a train wreck. And in that sort of a context, it's like it's like peyote in the Native American church. There's not a widespread peyote addiction because it's a sacred drug that's used within a specific ritual. And the idea of using it in everyday life is obscene. They just wouldn't do it. So there's a number of factors at work here. Industrialization is a big one, though. You're right. It's created ready access. People who might have the alcoholic gene, but might have lived completely productive lives without a single problem anytime from alcohol, with ready access to alcohol, suddenly their lives are a disaster. And this is just that illustration of that ancient Greek principle, and that Nietzsche talks about, that power is dangerous because power magnifies our character. And it doesn't just magnify the good parts, it magnifies the bad parts too. So things that might have been tiny problems can become big problems. So yeah, industrialization adds to our power. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was just going to actually state, just bring up the idea, that, there is this element of that it is really important to be able to, make mistakes, and to, kind of explore, the unknown, and to deal with uncertainty. Those are things that are absolutely essential in order for us to get the feedback that we need in order to grow. But I think that there needs to be a distinction between failures in exploring new ideas and failures in character. And failures in character are things that where we start to, it's when we allow the external desire to dictate that compromising that. And so essentially that our judgment is impaired because we don't necessarily know what is truly worth pursuing. And so that it's no longer an exploration out of curiosity anymore for its own intent, but rather it's more or less an exploration just for our own personal satisfaction, which is actually not I said that incorrectly. It's our personal satisfaction, yes, but at the expense of something that is much more important. So anyway, because ultimately it's one of those things there that we start to compromise on that, we start to compromise with one another, that kind of thing. And that ultimately isn't good for anyone. So anyway, I just think that delineation is important as well as the importance of being able to fail and deal with uncertainty.
Thanks, Joe. Phil, what's on your mind?
Two things I want to make. I'll be very brief about it. One is addressed to what Stephen said, and the other one to what Lisa said. The one that what Stephen said is an external factor to me, but I was wondering, there certainly is a relationship between the spirit of alcohol and the spirit of the soul. Okay. And I remember there was a measure that developed, I think, in the late 19th century about industrial production that America surpassed, and this is a funny measure, surpassed England in terms of industrial output in the late 19th century because they measured the consumption of beer. that in some sense, the United States has surpassed England in terms of consumption of beer. Now, I wonder whether that was because beer or alcohol, spirit in this sense, was to sharpen one's spiritual relationships, or whether it was sort of anesthetizing somebody from industrial production so they could put up with the drudgery of being in the factory. So I wonder which one it is, because it becomes a spiritual aspiration or a kind of a dulling of the senses, anesthetizing itself so we can get through the day. And that's the measure that drowned out industrial production as being productive. So for an individual, but it was very productive for society. So that was interesting. The other thing about what my comment to Lisa is, yeah, mistakes are very, very important. And this is a personal experience I had in art. I found that out when I was in art because I was still a student then. And one day I realized, I made a mistake. I had to change that. And things became better because I actually went to a different area. And then I began to say, well, if that's good, I'll just make some intentional mistakes. Oops, I made a mistake. And I finally realized that was wrong because that was inauthentic. It did not come out of production. It was something that I tried to trick myself into making a mistake. And authenticity comes out of the reality of trying to do something good or more excellent. And then you fail and you try to figure out a way out of it. And that was very productive. But if you just sort of like make a mistake so you could just practice something new, then that's inauthentic. In that sense, it was not so good. Now, luckily, I'm an artist, and an artist is not like a neurosurgeon in which I could imagine a neurosurgeon, I'm going to make a mistake so I can learn something.
Oh, he didn't.
You end up killing somebody. Anyway. As an artist, you're not going to kill anybody. I mean, it's a much more ambiguous relationship so that you develop something that somebody could digest. And the whole purpose of that is the degree of ambiguity to tease out the creative aspect that they have to continue to make interpretations in that thing, which is a different thing. By the way, in teaching, you not only teach what you know, there's also has to be a factor in which you encourage them that they need to go beyond what you teach. And I think that's very important. So there has to be a creative part. I think that's even true with neurosurgeons, but you got to be much more careful in that regard, because without that, then you're just passing down a rote memory, like a cheetah would pass through its offsprings, and they become a perfect specimen of their mother or the father. But because we live in this relationship between potentiality and actuality, there has to be that part. Otherwise, we are no longer human. We're really downgraded to just rote memory. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Good points. Donald, what's on your mind?
You can go ahead and intersperse something of your own here. Now, we've been talking a lot about character, and as some people say, it takes all kinds. And that's generally pretty good, because the polis, just like now, needed all kinds. And as Plato observed, there's nothing in nature that guarantees that the all kinds it provides will correspond to the all kinds it needs. So there can be a disproportion as well as a proportion. But it seems like, look, if a Greek looked at modernity, that one of the things would be that moderns don't want to accept their kind. Not that, we're in the country where anybody could become president. Well, in a disparaging sense, that's true. But in a healthy sense, it ought not to be true. Certain kinds ought not to be president, just like they ought not to be doctors and lawyers and such. And some of us, have to be cowboys or something, to quote Willie and Waylon there, kind of paraphrase them. And it's kind of, we started this sort of whole thing disparaging Kant for a bit. But, that was 2 years ago, so people are low. But one of the points he makes, if something can't be universalized, it ought not to become a general principle. And we really all can't be Aristoi. Even if we all had the character to be, we wouldn't need them all. Somebody's got to do the plumbing. Somebody's got to pick up the garbage, And the idea is, how do you get to a society that tries to get what types it needs closely in balance with what types of people it's producing, their character, have them be as good a person as they possibly can, and do their job as well as they can to get some sort of fulfillment. I gave up on being an Aristoi 50 years ago when I met Kenneth. You can tell him that sometime. But anyway, they're interesting to study hypothetically. Anyway, I hope you understand that we're just a lot of diversity, and it's by and large a necessary thing. It's not just a good thing, it's a necessary thing. But we spend precious little trying to see that the guy that fixes my air conditioner, and in Phoenix or Tempe here, and this last month, it's been very important that we have philosopher HVAC techs, you know. Not we don't.
May I just say something to what Donald just said? I think a couple of months ago, I think I asked, what does an Aristoi look like? And I agree with you, Donald. I think you can be an air conditioning tech, you can be a garbage man, but in my estimation, an Aristoi is, are you the best you can be at what you're doing? And I don't know if this is what the Greeks meant by being an Aristoi, but if in your sphere of influence, because you're right, society needs different levels of people to function, the polis, right? But if you can be the very, very best at what you're doing, is that not an Aristoi? I don't know.
I think in the Greeks they reserved that for people that ruled, that helped. I mean, that who actively pursued helping other people live the best lives they can live. They could lead in that. You know, the mastery of the technician or the plumber may not be something that he has the character resources to generate himself, you know. But I agree that when all people in a society have the support to be the best, it's probably a society in which some really good people are at the top organizing things. You know, I wouldn't say Greece probably fails that. Athens probably fails that too, but we don't even try by and large, but we should. But I mean, I think you see people that achieve what you said, but I think the sources that drive them to that are their families, their churches, their communities, not their government. It's not the government doing it in our society, you know. Therefore, I would say we're not aristic in our organization.
Yeah, Kenneth would agree for sure. Before I call on Phil, we're like a couple of words away from Sophrosune, and I really want to get us there because this is one of the definitions of an Aristos. So it goes right to what Sharon's asking about. This is like the punchline, but we might not get there today because we've only got 12 minutes left. So I'm going to do one more word and then I'm going to call on Phil. So Phil, don't forget what you were going to say. Hang on to it. So we talked about sophron, and that has to do with being conscious of your limits, and I put keeping your head as well, but what that really means is being conscious of when you are not keeping to your limits, like when you are suffering from entheos, right? When you are possessed by a care, you have to be able to notice when you're off your rocker. You have to be able to notice when you're not functioning at your best. As in medical software, it means I need to take sick leave on the days when my brain is scattered. If I take a scattered brain in while I'm modifying medical software, I could kill somebody. You know, if it's supposed to say warn him if there's an allergy, and I accidentally put one character in there that turns it into a not, then it doesn't warn the doctor if there's an allergy. And the next thing you know, he's giving somebody a drug that's going to kill them. So I have to know my limits with regard to this. And that means I got to, pull myself out of situations that I'm not prepared for, even if it's just temporary. So sophron. But the other half of sophrosune is phronesis. And phronesis is that ability, it's that internal compass that points towards health and vitality. Phronesis is the desire of the Canada goose to migrate when it's time to go south or time to go north. It's the sum total of the structure of their ethos that makes them take an interest in all of those things they ought to be paying attention to live a healthy Canada goose life. And the phronesis of a Canada goose is therefore completely different from the phronesis of a salmon. You know, how and why and when a salmon migrates and what a salmon does when it's not migrating, they're very fishy things and not very birdy things, but they're equally important. If the salmon doesn't do those things, the entire species could collapse. It has to do those things, and it does those things because, and this goes to something that Joe mentioned earlier when he referenced signal to noise. You know, the biggest problem for a mortal is that we live in an infinite cosmos, but we only have a finite attention span. How do you know what you're supposed to be paying attention to in any given moment? And the answer for most animal species is long, difficult processes of evolution lasting billions of years have tuned up a pretty good suite of instincts such that, you know, if you ever saw that Far Side cartoon when it says, you know, what we say and what dogs hear, what dogs, you know, you could be having a conversation with your dog Ginger, but what the dog hears is blah, 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 Ginger, blah, blah, blah. It's like, my name, that's my name. I'm so excited. That's my name. You know, but what's missing from that is the dog is also excited about the squirrel and about whether it's time to go potty and about, you know, all the doggy things. Where are the other dogs that have been here lately? All the other things that make a dog's life work as a natural thing. That's all part of the dog phronesis. And, you know, I think it was the movie Up, right, from Pixar, in which we get to see the intelligent dogs that can talk, and they're busy strategizing and having plans right up until in the middle of a conversation about to say something important, he goes, squirrel. And they all pause and they all look around. Where's the squirrel? Where's the squirrel? Where's the squirrel? This is doggy phronesis in action. You know, plotting to take over the world is all well and fine for Homo sapiens, but for a dog, it can't even compare to, oh my God, it's a squirrel. For the love of God, run, it's a squirrel, right? Dogs should be interested in squirrels, and their instincts make it so that everything else drops into the background at the moment when the important thing enters the environment and suddenly displaces it in the foreground of their consciousness. This is how most animals work. The evolution has keyed up their attention span into a kind of phronesis, a kind of compass that points towards the things they ought to care about. And the problem for Homo sapiens, according to the ancient Greeks, is that we retain the capacity for enthusiasm and theos, but we've lost the feature where our enthusiasms always point us towards health and vitality. They might point towards anything that we're obsessed with. I mean, that's Homo sapiens in a nutshell. Instead of squirrel, it could be Pokemon. Oh my God, Pokemon. Or, oh, they're throwing Space Seed tonight at 6 p.m. How do you, I'm sorry, I know we had plans, but I absolutely have to see Ricardo Montalban for TradeCon. I mean, it's been too long. I need it, right? I mean, enthusiasm, Homo sapiens, this is our thing. You know, it creates an enormous freedom at the same time that it creates an enormous danger, which is, for the life of us, we can't find north. You know, where north is our survival and the things we need to pay attention to. This is how we got made so smart and creative, is by making us deeply, deeply foolish. This is the ancient Greek perspective, and this is the core feature. This is the essence of Homo sapiens, according to the ancient Greeks. If we are to have phronesis, we aren't going to get it the way animals get it by birth. We need a culture that works, that has a theia that actually successfully lead to fishing and reindeer herding and, you know, building airplanes that don't fall out of the sky. We need a successful suite of theia within our larger culture so that when we're born into it, we're imitating patterns of life that work. And it's not to say that we're not allowed to experiment or make mistakes or anything else. It's to say that the default position works and that we grow into, if we have no particular virtue and no particular creativity, we'll still end up like a dumb animal versus a smart animal, we'll still mostly end up pointed in the right direction if our culture does that for us, if it can give us sort of a prosthetic phronesis, a simulacrum of phronesis. The hazard is that it's not true phronesis. It doesn't go down into our character. It's certainly not genetic. Our genetics strip us of this feature, but it's better than nothing. And, we made it 200,000 to 400,000 years. So mostly this model seems to more or less work. It may be off its rocker for the last few thousand years, but in general, we know from the track record that it seems to be possible for Homo sapiens to be a going concern as long as we remain a cultural animal that creates this matrix within which people can artificially develop, learn, and grow into a kind of substitute for phronesis. but if we don't live in such a culture, if we live in an anti-culture, a really broken or exploitative set of relationships, then our driving, yearning need to complete ourselves, to create a phronesis substitute, instead can fill in something else. We could be filled in with an anti-phronesis that turns us into the perfect dupes for con men. And because we lack phronesis at the level of genetic character in our species, we can't tell the difference between having been raised as dupes versus having been raised with phronesis. They're equally satisfying in that they equally plug into the same receptors in us that are desperate for culture. We can't tell them apart. Animals, other than highly domesticated animals, most animals do not have this liability that we have. But if we know about it, this goes back to the early terms, right? Like phylactose and aphylactose. If we know we have this defect of character, then we can be on guard against it. And we can work to create cultures that help children to grow up and flourish and grow into healthy forms. But if we don't know it, if we assume that we're all born equal and wise and free and no problems, nothing to worry about, then instead we all grow up into being dupes. It's a major defect in our species. It's a weakness. It's a vulnerability. So this is why I put a different definition for phronesis here. Is I'm trying to show the relationship between, on the one hand, which way does health and vitality lie, and on the other hand, what are my arites and what are their limits, so that I can figure out how to construct a life strategy that could possibly lead to health and vitality. We have to sort of piece these things together. And I guess I will save Sophrosune for next time because I want to call on Phil. So Phil, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, what came up with Donald is curiously a relationship between Athens, the late Athens of the Darien League, of the desire for wealth and money that have completely changed it, and the contemporary society. Now, I have no problem in a limited sense with a hierarchical structure, because I think certain better people should be given the jobs that help the society become better and so forth. But there is a very, very important balance between the hierarchy and the system of fairness in the distribution. And the problem when wealth is interjected as the medium, that is the measure of this relationship, then in a sense, the distribution is not good, because now we have people, for instance, like Jeff Bezos, he earns so much money that it would take an average person maybe 10,000 years to equal the weight of his earning. And if that's the measure, then that the distribution is totally out of proportion. Yes, maybe even if he was a virtuous person, maybe he should be given more, but not to that degree that it's just we all have one life, and that fairness of distribution should equalize that to a certain degree, number one. And number two, the distortion, in a sense, puts you in a money structure rather than a structure of arete, and so you pursue that instead of like what is good for not only your own character, but the character of society. And I think that distortion is somehow become so unfair that it's just not right. And I remember, I think it was just last Friday, I was in a Kierkegaard thing, and there was about the sweeper woman, who's very, very humble and pious. And what she was struggling for was just that she was doing the best she can, whatever it is, and that was virtue. And I made a comment, yeah, that might be virtue in a well-organized society, but an exploitative society, I, as the ruler who's exploitive, wouldn't be happy with the happier that individual to have somebody who doesn't care how much you exploit it, as long as they go do the job and be satisfied they're doing well. Of course, you can take advantage of them to such a degree that I guess you can't go to a point where they actually starve to death because you will lose this good worker, but just enough that they keep on living and producing the best they can. How much exploitation would that be? And I think we're getting to that point. And I think people understand the distribution is not right. There should be a proper distribution that's fair, that honors, in a sense, the people who are higher in the hierarchy in a true sense. But even that, one should still be, in a sense, be within a fair distribution that they could live, rather than starvation, just enough so they could come in and do the best they can as a sweeper woman. I mean, that's like,
Right.
that is like fantastically horrible, And to say that, yeah, that would be, no doubt she's living a virtuous life, but she is being exploited to the nth degree. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil.
Yeah, I know you're done, but could we start with phronesis next week? Because I still
Yes.
don't make the connection between the two different definitions. I can't see the integrative point. Please?
Yes, we'll start exactly there next week. And,
Thank you.
and armed with that, we'll be able to define sophrosune for the first time. And then with that, we can define aristoi in terms of sophrosune. And then based on that, we'll be able to talk about the ancient Greeks had a completely different idea about the problems with extreme wealth and extreme poverty as fountains of tragedy, which we'll be able to get into next week as well. So it's interesting. They were a whole lot less concerned with fairness, and they were a whole lot more concerned with how do extreme wealth and extreme poverty warp character to such an extent that it leaves people vulnerable to these charis, to gnosis and overreach and hubris. So we'll talk about that stuff next week, but we'll start with phronesis, just like you say, Sharon.
Thank you.
Hope you all had a good time. I had a great time.
Yes,
And,
I did. I had a good time. Very good time.
Is
Learned a
that
lot.
is that a promise, Nick? Rick?
Yes, that's a promise.
I'll remind him if he forgets.
Okay.
Excellent. Take care,
Thank you.
everyone. Have a great
Bye-bye.
week.
Thank you, Phil.
Yes.